Hello, everyone, and welcome to the PSBTA Global Forum, Insights on Implementing a Nationwide Public Safety Broadband Network. My name is Martha Ellis, and I'm a retired division chief from the Salt Lake City Fire Department, and now serve as the executive director for the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association, or the PSBTA. If you are unfamiliar with our association, our mission is to work as a broadband end user advocate for first responders and service providers. The association was founded by 3 members of the public safety leadership who were instrumental in setting the foundation for FirstNet by securing the D-Block spectrum. We're collaborating with the FirstNet Authority and FirstNet built with AT&T to bring you this global forum. We understand that there are many of you at different stages of trying to implement your own nationwide public safety broadband network. Our hope is that by sharing our story and providing insights into our missteps, near misses, and successes, that we can help in some way with your effort. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. All attendees have been muted to reduce background noise. Any questions should be submitted directly to us through the questions function found in the control panel on the right side of your screen. Our first 4 sessions are pre-recorded, but we will still be able to field your questions throughout the webinar. Questions will be answered during our live roundtable discussion. We will answer as many questions as possible and follow up with those that we don't get to during the live segment. An email will also be provided, so if you have additional questions after we conclude today, you can send them to us directly. Before we jump into our presentations, I want to give you a quick overview of our program. I also want to mention that all of our speakers today will be sharing firsthand experiences as they all played important roles in the development of FirstNet. We'll kick things off with an introduction to our association by our president and retired fire chief, Al Gillespie. The first session will be a panel discussion with retired assistant police chief, Chuck Dowd, and our association vice president, Richard Murgon. We'll discuss the early stages of concept development and the necessary paradigm shift in public safety communication norms to embracing the potential of first responders more effectively leveraging broadband spectrum. From concept to legislation, retired police chief Chris Moore, retired fire chief Jeff Johnson, and retired paramedic services chief Kevin McGinnis will discuss what it took to build the necessary coalitions and assure that all the key elements were included in the legislative language. Once the bill had been signed, the hard work of standing up the FirstNet Authority and seeking out the right private partner began. Former FirstNet board chair Sue Swenson and FirstNet Chief Executive Officer Ed Parkinson and FirstNet Chief Technology Officer Jeff Bratcher will discuss all of the critical elements of setting FirstNet onto a successful lifetime course. Our final session is a discussion with Jim Bugel, Vice President over FirstNet for AT&T. Jim will share insights from the private sector perspective and how and why AT&T joined the FirstNet effort. Our program concludes with a roundtable discussion with our panelists. We will try to answer as many of your questions during this live portion. I want to thank you all for taking time to join us and hope that you will find all of our interviews and discussions helpful. The entire webinar will be recorded and made available shortly after we conclude. With that, I would like to introduce Chief Al Gillespie. Chief, would you start by telling us a little bit on how you got involved with the FirstNet effort and why you felt it was so important to create the PSBTA?
Good morning, Martha, and hello to all those that are participating in this. They're longtime friends, and we work very hard together to get where we're at. And also thank you for all the attendees. We hope we have some information that will be helpful for you, and we hope you bring information to us that helps us further our cause. As Martha said, I'm a retired fire chief from North Las Vegas, Nevada, and spent my career almost 40 years worth working fire and EMS, emergency medical services around the United States. In the mid 2000s, or toward the late 2008, 2009 era, I served in the as part of the International Association of Fire Chiefs Executive Board and became president of that particular organization in 2011, 2012. As a first responder and as a fire chief, we found that communication was always a problem on emergency scenes and large non-emergency events between all of our public safety organizations. And it was exacerbated with major events like the 9/11 event. Several of the folks here on this call were instrumental in getting started the process to try and grab the bandwidth that was available for public safety. It was available, but public safety really needed that bandwidth to provide communication to go beyond our radios. So once the legislation passed, which was in 2012, and you're going to hear a long history about this, my partner and I, Dick Murgon, and one other, saw a bit of a gap in our ability to train and educate first responders and those who help the first responders use FirstNet, find out what's available with it, and talk about the hardware and software tools and the applications that are available to first responders here in the United States. So we started a Public Safety Broadband Technology Association, and that Public Safety Broadband Technology Association is what's sponsoring this right now and bringing it to you. So with the advent of that, we were able to do forums around our country to help educate people that are using FirstNet, those that want to use FirstNet, and those who are unsure of what FirstNet was, to provide communications for the public safety. With that being said, I'm going to hand this back over to Martha, and she's going to walk through with those participants in our forum, and I look forward to talking to you again at the roundtable at the end of this.
This is session 1, Rethinking Emergency Communications. This discussion will focus on early concept development and the necessary paradigm shift which led to the development of FirstNet. With us today are former APCO president and our association vice president, Richard Murgon, and retired assistant police chief with the New York City Police Department, Chuck Dowd. Gentlemen, I want to thank you for being with us today. Before we jump into our discussion, would you both take a minute to introduce yourselves? And Chuck, I'm just going to start with you.
Thank you so much, Martha, and good morning, everyone. As Martha said, I am Chuck Dowd. I'm a retired assistant chief with the NYPD. I spent 34.5 years there, the last 12 of which were largely concentrated around public safety communications and 911 work. I've had quite a long career within the department, both on patrol, Detective Bureau, narcotics, various locations. But as I said, communications was my world for the last 12 years. And I got involved in this whole FirstNet effort. And at one point, after we were successful, and we will discuss that more as we go on, I was a inaugural board member of the board of directors of FirstNet.
Richard?
Thanks, Martha. Again, my name is Dick Murgon. I'm a retired law enforcement officer out of Colorado. Then for my second career, I was a department head in Northern Nevada, where I oversaw public safety communications and another number of other public safety type operations. And during that same time, I became a board member on APCO International's board of directors and was president of APCO during the time that we started up this effort of what became FirstNet.
Fantastic. Chief Dowd, I was going to ask you to share your experiences on 9/11. Can you explain what your role was at the time and just share a little bit of the insights of what happened for you personally during that time period?
Thank you, Martha. I'd be happy to. My responsibilities at the time, I was a police captain for the NYPD. I was responsible for the New York City 911 call taking operation, which is run by the NYPD even today, and all things communications operations from the radio, which is very extensive in the NYPD. We have over 50 channels that we utilize on a regular basis. So on 9/11, those were my responsibilities. It was, as everybody knows, very well documented, a horrific time for the city of New York and for the country. we had a situation where, you know, literally thousands of phone calls were flooding into the 911 center. It was really a Herculean effort on the part of our call takers and our dispatchers to keep up with that, and the fire dispatchers for that matter. It was particularly tough on the fire dispatchers simply because they don't normally handle that kind of volume, and it was, you know, it was a very difficult time for them to do that. One of the major takeaways of that event was, to us, it was clear that our communications capabilities, while fairly extensive, were not nearly what they needed to be, nor as flexible as they needed to be. And as a result of that, we were unable to have communications between even the FDNY and the NYPD, which was well documented in many studies that were done after the event. While our police radio system worked well, fire department, quite frankly, struggled a great deal simply because their normal point-to-point operations were severely tested during the event. And as a result, our inability to communicate with each other and other public safety emergency first responders from the region who responded to the city on that day were very problematic for us.
So clearly it was a time to start reassessing the framework of emergency communications. And I know that there were other key events that were part of that, which we'll also discuss in a bit. So let's talk a little bit about the development of the Public Safety Alliance. Richard, can you talk a little bit about what that was all about? I mean, you guys were key players in creating that. Tell us what the mission was behind that and how it came to be.
Sure, and you know, and Chuck owns a fair amount of, you know, getting this started. Even though he kind of came in almost a day later, and not a day late as in late, but you know, for my part, it started with Chris Moore. Chris Moore had asked for a meeting with APCO. I happened to be the guy that went to that meeting, and Chris had said, look, you know, we'd had a number of efforts in this country to try and create a public safety broadband network that had failed. For those who go back in history, there was an auction where there was an intent to share with public safety, and it didn't happen. And Chris is basically laying out and says, look, you know, we think that, you know, we need to go after that spectrum legislatively and go after funding. And as that conversation went on, is when Chris explained to me that it was really Chuck Dowd who had brought it up and said, look, you know, we need to go after this. And as that conversation kind of developed, we said, okay, you know, we got APCO, a techie guy here. We got a police chief, and we got a assistant police chief from NYPD. We got all these key people. We need a fire guy. And that's when we brought in Jeff Johnson, and the four of us started noodling around, how do you do this? And we decided, look, this needed to be a bigger coalition. This has to be bigger than the four of us. It had to be a national effort. So that's when we started looking at creating partnerships with the other associations. And that was kind of the impetus from my point of view. But Chuck, I know I'm sure there's some blanks I'm missing. You want to fill in there?
Yeah, and so to Dick's point, we knew we had to change this based on their, you know, the experiences on September 11th and during those attacks. Don't forget, you know, these things occurred in different locations around the country. You know, while the focus in many ways was on New York City, there were attacks you know, on airplanes that ended up as rural incidents. With one of them, you had the incidents in Washington D.C. So we looked at this and again we looked at it and said, how do we address this? And the solution can't just be a big city solution. That was one of the first things that came up in this whole effort. We looked at this, and I spoke to my guys, and I had the benefit, because we were in a large organization, of having a technical staff that could really kind of brief me and help me understand this. But one of the first questions I asked, and one of the first questions, quite frankly, that Dick asked me, you know, from an APCO perspective was, hey, This can't just work for places like, San Jose, where Chris Moore is, or New York City or Chicago. This has to work for everybody in public safety. And if it doesn't, this will never get off the ground. So Dick, could you touch on the importance on the smaller entity rural site?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we tend to forget, a lot of people say, well, I'll never have a terrorist attack like New York City had, or I'm not that big. Well, when you look at Katrina, hurricane, and the hurricanes in Florida, the wildland fires that occur in California, this is really, it applies to everybody every day. And one of the lessons learned in public safety, that whether you look at our 911 effort or our P25 effort in this country for LMR, we always have the haves and have-nots. That the places that have the money can pay for it. Grants are distributed out of the federal government, population-based. So you end up with people in South Dakota and Montana and New Mexico and Alabama that can't afford these services or don't have it. So we decided this effort had to be a national effort. And that's what really drove us to band together, was to make sure we didn't make those mistakes of the past and create this haves and have-nots, because that person in the middle of a traffic accident in North Dakota, 100 miles from a hospital, and that paramedic showing up has to have this access to the same resources as that medic in the middle of New York City or DC, because both lives are just as important and need those resources. So this really became a national effort to make sure that everybody had the same level of service, the same opportunity, because our citizens deserve nothing less.
Well, and I love that you brought that up, Dick, because I was thinking Kearney, Nebraska. When I went out to Kearney, Nebraska for an event, it became so clear to me that those folks in those rural communities, they weren't privy to the type of coverage and capacity that those that might be in those metropolitan areas were having access to. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Your heart attack in the middle of Nebraska is just as important to you as anybody else's emergency in those large metro areas. So clearly that that inclusiveness and that universal access was a really brilliant component of the strategy.
And that is why the Public Safety Alliance was so important. It included everybody, all the associations. We worked with National Governors Association, National Association of Counties. This literally was an effort of everybody banding together. And as I'm sure you will hear Jeff Johnson talk about it, because he is much more eloquent at discussing this, is this was cats and dogs playing together in the same sandbox. And it just doesn't happen in this country. And it's the only time that it's happened. And, God bless everybody for coming to the table, because we needed the small, the large, the people who were in tune with the technology, the people who didn't know how to use it. They were all at the table. And again, hats off to Chuck Dowd. He pushed a lot of that. Having somebody from New York City saying, we have to include those people, was important. And I want to.
Dick, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. And so, again, the first meeting that we had at the NYPD with my guys on this, and just trying to postulate where did we want to go here. The first question I asked, I said, look, everybody's going to look at this, and the first thing they're going to say, sure, New York City wants this because it's New York City, they're the big dog. And I said to my guys, look, if this doesn't work for everybody, then it doesn't work. We cannot look at this from a big city perspective. This has to work everywhere. And that's why it was critically important that we pulled in Dick Mergon and APCO, because quite frankly, without APCO's reach into the rural areas, into the smaller communities, we couldn't have been nearly as effective on this effort as we was. And we are quite proud of the fact, I'll be honest with you, quite proud of the fact that we were able, for the first time in the country's history, when it came to public safety, getting every first responder on the same page on one effort.
So, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is exactly where I want to go next. So let's talk about the PSA, the Public Safety Alliance. Now, everybody has experienced bringing all of these different perspectives into the room, and sometimes those conversations can get derailed in a hurry, just because everybody has their own interests to fend for, correct? So what was your strategy for bringing all these different perspectives into the room and making sure that when you left the room, you had a very common and united message?
Our strategy was to tell Chris Moore he was in charge.
You know what, though? That's a brilliant point. You do have
but he makes
Martha.
Martha, he does make a good point, because because we kind of started it in New York because of the September 11th effect. But really, one of the reasons that we felt from the start that it wasn't a good idea to have somebody like me lead it or anybody from New York City for that matter, was simply because we didn't like the visual of that. We didn't, so yeah, that's when we went out and grabbed Chris Moore and said, guess what, Chris, lucky you're in charge of this,
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
but
we
Chuck,
we
I
had
gotta,
to have that be, I mean, what Chris really did, I mean, tongue in cheek, all fun aside, Chris has got an excellent ability to listen to people, bring people together. He was the right person at the right time. Not that everybody else didn't, but that law enforcement flavor he brought to the table, that major cities component he had to be able to work with those major city chiefs. Like I said, a lot of coalitions, when you build things, you really have to look at the personality of the person, the people at the table, who you're trying to talk to. And he just inherently was that guy. Now, if it had played on anybody different, could it have been somebody else? Absolutely. But he happened to be the right guy at the right time. And again, a lot of discussion went into who should lead and why. This one of the things we got past was egos and people going, oh, I want to be me, or it should be my association. All that got off the table. And as we started talking to this larger group and putting them together, we also knew that we had to narrow this down to some fundamental principles. And, those fundamental principles that everybody at the table could agree with. We agreed that we needed the spectrum. We agreed that we needed funding, and we agreed that we needed governance. Now, we went down a lot of rabbit holes about people going, I want this, that, or the other thing, but it kept coming back to those fundamentals. And as long as we focused on those core fundamentals, everybody stayed together. There were a lot of times we said, look, the people on the Hill are going to answer some of these for us because they're going to have their input. And then you're going to have the FirstNet of the governance part answer some of it that'll be out of our control. So that's why it was also important to look at the governance part of this, what the board makeup would be. And the board makeup you see today is actually what we had recommended, to include the Peace Act, where we've got all those public safety. Fundamentally, think of the Peace Act as an extension of the Public Safety Alliance. They're now permanent in place to help drive that discussion. So, those conversations were really important to keep everybody focused on really what's really important and what do we really can we control without getting down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, so boy, you guys really put a lot of interesting things out on the table right there. First and foremost, I'm hearing check your ego at the door. Clearly, this cannot be an exercise in leg wrestling. It has to be an exercise in collaboration. The other thing that I really liked, Chuck, was when you were so astute to be able to recognize that New York City could not necessarily lead this effort, that it had to have more of a united front going into it in order for it to be successful, which I thought was brilliant. The other thing, find your leaders. Again, it's so important to be able to not only find those people that have the subject matter expertise, but have that ability to communicate and bring people together and find that common purpose, right? To bring people out of necessarily their personal interest, but draw them into that common interest. And then, the core fundamentals. Again, you guys brought up some really excellent points in this little session here. And the ongoing input of public safety, right? This isn't something that public safety builds and then walks away from with the hopes that, the governmental or corporate interests will continue to foster the interest for the first responder. So I really hope what the listeners are getting out of this are these really key benchmarks that you guys are laying out in this formative time.
Yeah, so Martha, all good points. And again, the focus on this was, as Dick said, and let me give you a slightly different take on it, is, public safety's history is replete with examples of us being reactive to an emergency instead of proactive. This was an effort to be proactive, looking out in front, not 2 years or 3 years, but we were looking out 5, 10, and 20 years and saying, what's the communications landscape in public safety going to look like? What do we need it to look like? What's going to happen here? And it became clear to us that we had to look at this from a very different perspective. And quite frankly, with some folks in public safety communications, it was almost heretical what we were saying at the onset of this, which has now become mainstream, which is it's gratifying to see. But we looked at things like, we have to look at getting into the same technology that the rest of the world uses, right? So LTE was the focus. We had to be willing to accept that a public-private partnership with prioritization for public safety could be effective, both from an operational perspective and from, very importantly, from a financial perspective, because we had to be realistic about this. This thing couldn't work if we had to constantly go back to Washington and say, give us another 10 billion, give us another 20 billion. That this was going to be a real struggle, and then over the long haul, there was the risk that it could fail.
Yeah,
Well,
a
absolutely.
couple other key points on that is one of the important parts was the role that APCO played. This effort wasn't going to be free. People coming across the country had to travel, pay for travel. Associations had budgets locked down, had budget constraints, and you've got important associations like major city chiefs, but they don't have a big budget because there's not a lot of them. APCO is financially a very healthy organization. APCO was built to support public safety communications. I went back to my board and said, look, we need to be the people that help fund this travel, fund the Public Safety Alliance, use our membership money to do that. And that's fundamentally what we did. So it was important that we had, for lack of a better term, a fiscal agent, a way to pay for some of the things that we knew were going to cost us. The other thing that was important to this is, there were a lot of naysayers that were saying, look, just use commercial services. Well, actually, the carriers helped us a lot because there was one meeting we were at, and luckily there were some key people there, people from the White House and the Hill, where the question was, look, just get this from the carriers, and not to point out any carriers because this isn't really about them. We had a carrier stand up and we said, look, we want preemption and we want priority on the network. And they set up and said, we'll never do that. That we as carriers cannot do that. We have commercial customers. There's some rules in place that they believe wouldn't allow it. And another carrier stood up and talked about, they agreed they couldn't do it either. So that really helped set the record that we had to have our own network. Now, the other thing that I want to point out, I want to give Chuck credit for, is don't be afraid of stepping outside of the norm. So in a network, you can set priority. Preemption's kind of unheard of. And I remember Chuck was talking, I think it was in a hearing, mentioned, we need ruthless preemption. Everybody's going, oh yeah, okay, you need ruthless preemption. We leave the meeting and one of the engineers from one of the carriers says, what's ruthless preemption? I go, well, it's where you knock everybody else. No, it doesn't exist. There's no such term. Well, all of a sudden, Chuck is laying out the vision that now you can do that. That wasn't something that was in the standard, but it is today. And it was through that vision that allowed us to drive home the things public safety had to have with that network.
And, again, great points. The vision to not only stake your claim, first of all, the vision to recognize that we had to really shift our thought process from that LMR radio to really leveraging what was available to us on the broadband spectrum. So staking our claim in that regard, but then having that ability and that willingness to really push the boundaries of creativity and innovation in that space. So and of course the funding was a part that I didn't really even think about before you brought it up, Dick. So I'm glad you included that, because clearly money does not grow on trees, and getting people together and having these conversations and really building sound coalitions is going to involve getting people in the room. So great points. Now, Dick, you did mention the commercial carriers pretty much saying, well, you're never going to get preemption. Can you talk a little bit more about the early stages of working with the commercial carriers and looking for advocacy within that area?
And actually, I'm going to hand that off to Chuck, and here's why. If people won't do it for New York City, they won't do it for any. I mean, realistically, there are companies who've built specific radios for them because their numbers are so large. So the fact that, when New York City talks and people give an answer, that's really important. So Chuck, you want to talk about that if you would, please?
So let me just back up for a second and talk about the whole notion of defining what it is we want this to look like. We invented a number of terms. Like, this is a term that's constantly used nowadays, mission critical broadband. We coined that term. This group coined that term. Mission critical push to talk. We coined that term. And the reason for doing that is not to be able to take credit for it, but more importantly, to be able to define it. What is it? What does it look like? Because in many cases, in a history of public safety, quite frankly, some of the commercial suppliers to public safety, some of the vendors that service public safety, had a history of kind of managing that for us, and we didn't want that to happen in this case. We wanted to be the defining entity on what it is this needed to be, and that's not, talking about, Dick talked about the, carriers getting up and saying we will never do that. That was not a bad thing. That was an honest thing. They had a larger mission than just public safety. They have to service the entire country, quite frankly. They are a commercial entity that has an obligation to service the public on a commercial basis. So that's not a bad thing. And when we talk about that, it's not really a criticism like, like they're bad for that kind of thing. It's just a reality that we understood, I think, in the Public Safety Alliance, and why we needed to focus on getting spectrum for public safety and building a public safety network.
Yeah, and those are all great points, because some of those things can feel like unrelenting pushback, when really you have to reframe them into how do I leverage this information to create what we're trying to get, right? I mean, it's just a matter of taking what feels like a beat down and turn it into something that is proactive and how you can leverage that information.
And we have to remember that on any given day, people are dialing 911 on their cell phone. Their call getting through, it's obviously critical. If we don't know they've got a problem, we can't respond as first responders. So, we clearly get the carrier's point. And like Chuck said, it wasn't a bad thing. It was just, that was a reality of the world in front of us.
No, I love that. So, gentlemen, we're getting to the end of our interview. Is there anything that you would like to add in conclusion before we close session one?
Yeah, Martha, so just real quick, I mean, we hope that we kind of gave a little bit of the history of this and the sense of it. And I think the one thing we haven't mentioned here is while this was federally created, it was created by federal legislation obligated to public safety. This is public safety's network. This is an evolving, constantly evolving capability, communications capability. It has blossomed now into an industry, which is gratifying again to us. But the important thing to know is, for even the small organizations around the country, is that your voice matters. What you need, what you experience when there's something there that doesn't go like it should have gone, you need to push that up through the public safety organizations that serve you. Push that up through the PSSA, or the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association. Push that information up so that we can get it to FirstNet, or get it directly to FirstNet, so that we can make the changes over time that we need for this network.
And you're going to hear in the next. You're going to hear in the next session from Kevin and Chris and Jeff Johnson about how important this whole coalition and keeping everybody together was on the Hill, and going through that legislation. That we had some false starts, we had clearly a lot of challenges, but the part that they're going to talk about also represents the constituents of all those people on the Hill. So it's that whole part obviously was a key to the success of this, and their perspectives on getting the elected officials to buy into this and to be champions for this was extremely important.
Yeah, exactly. Well, gentlemen, you did a fantastic job of laying out the underpinnings of what became FirstNet. I want to thank you for your time. And now we are going to move on to our next session, from concept to legislation. Taking a great idea from the notepad to law takes commitment, organization, and a solid plan. In session 2, we'll be talking about strategic adjustments, conviction to the mission, and the importance of building coalitions with key stakeholders and influencers. Our speakers for session 2 were in the trenches during the entire legislative effort. Retired Fire Chief Jeff Johnson, retired Police Chief Chris Moore, and retired Paramedic Services Chief Kevin McGinnis are here to give you their firsthand accounting of the events that led to the codification of the allocation of Band 14 to the public safety community. Welcome, gentlemen, and I would like to start off by giving you each a minute to introduce yourselves. Chief Moore, I'm going to start with you.
Well, thank you, Martha, and thank you to everybody attending this webinar. We hope that you take something away from it. My name is Chris Moore. I spent 31 years in law enforcement in California. I went through the ranks at the San Jose Police Department in Silicon Valley, the city over a little over 1 million people. And through the ranks, I had the opportunity to run a number of different units, and in addition to many years in patrol and special operations. I did spend some time as a public information officer, as well as commander of internal affairs. I took a slight detour to go to Washington, D.C. for a year, just as counsel to the Attorney General back in 1999 and 2000. After that, I was assigned to run our 911 center after a very disastrous CAD rollout. I didn't know much about technology at the time, and I think back, I had to learn in a big fat hurry how things work, why things don't work, and how critical those systems were. It turned out to be one of the best things in my career. Some people think that's the place to go, that you get shuffled off to, and clearly that's not the case. At the end of the day, I rose through the ranks, became chief officer, assistant chief, and then chief of the San Jose Police Department. Along that way, though, on behalf of the major city chiefs, because I knew a little bit more than most of the major city chiefs, but not much, I was assigned to run their technology unit, and in the sense to run these issues. That was where I had the opportunity to meet Chuck Dowd, and I think you heard a little bit from Chuck about how that happened, and we'll talk about that moving forward, why those relationships are so important, and the trust that's established between these different associations to make sure that we, as public safety, get what we need. Martha, I think I'll leave it there and pick it up later.
Great, thank you. Chief Johnson.
Thank you, Jeff Johnson, Chief Executive for the Western Fire Chiefs Association. We serve the 11 Western states of the United States. I was past president, like Mr. Gillespie, of the International Fire Chiefs, and had a long history in LMR tech prior to that phase of my life. As fire chief of one of the 100 largest departments in the country for 15 years, and I was lucky enough to join this group of visionaries to execute on this project.
Great, and Chief McGinnis.
Thanks, Martha. I've been in emergency medical services for some 47 years. My day job has been building EMS systems as a paramedic service chief, as a regional EMS director, as an emergency department director, and as a state EMS director. My nighttime job has always been in the back of an ambulance to see how badly I screwed up my daytime job. That happened. Since about 2003, I've served the National Association of State EMS Officials as a public safety telecommunications advisor, as well as 4 other national EMS associations. And during that time, got interested in what became the public safety broadband network, and then FirstNet back as far as 2006, and was on the initial public FirstNet board as a member of that board, and served for 6 years. And I currently serve on the Public Safety Advisory Committee for FirstNet.
Excellent. So clearly staying very engaged in the whole process. So we appreciate your commitment, Chief McGinnis. All right, let's jump into the conversation of taking this from concept to legislation. And Chief Johnson, I'd like to start with you. The D-Block effort was not public safety's first swing at securing adequate spectrum for current and future needs. Can you talk a little bit about the initial effort and what type of strategy changes had to occur in order to secure what is now FirstNet?
Great question. I mean, Chief McGinnis, who's on this webinar today, and Harlan McEwen, and a number of visionaries actually took the first run at this by the creation of a public safety spectrum trust. Of course, there's a lot of elements that go into it, but at the end of the day, that went to auction, and the auction was unsuccessful to find a partner for us. in round one. So that's really when the next wave of us joined in conversation with the early entrants. And we talked about, okay, why didn't we get a good partner? What's it take? What are the elements that we need? And then we start pushing against that. So I just don't think that people should have the expectation that your first idea is going to be successful. And we learn from one another. And that doesn't mean that each of us weren't a bit vested in our own thoughts on it. But at the end of the day, it was the definition of compromise that brought us together. And some of the private arguments that we had with each other about what's the best way to do it led to a completely different way of thinking about it. And in the end, we got it done.
And I have to applaud you. You clearly are well versed in the world of politics, vested in our own thoughts. That was very nicely stated. But I love how you clearly it's about coming out of those interests and finding the common purpose, which is what you were really framing up there for us, Chief. And also, gentlemen, I want to invite you all, if you have something to add to any of these questions, please feel free to jump in and expand on any of them. So what I want to
Martha, now that you did that invitation, let me just jump on what Jeff said.
Please.
Kevin was actually there.
Exactly.
10 years as a state EMS director in Maine gave me a lot of experience with the legislative process in the state house. And I'd say probably in that time, we had more failures in terms of legislation than we had successes. When we got involved in the Public Safety Spectrum Trust and that didn't go, I was getting pretty depressed because my history was just not standing up there. But the one thing that I learned from the FirstNet effort through the years was it can be done. Something as big as FirstNet can be done if you get the right players involved and go about it the right way. I was shocked when we succeeded with FirstNet. And I'm shocked today, but it can be done. So don't give up.
And Kevin, if I could follow on that just a little bit, I'm going to make every lobbyist on the planet mad what I'm about to say. But lobbyists, by their nature, are better at playing defense. They would rather spend their energy protecting you from something inbound than help you come up with a major move that completely alters the course of history. That's a lot of work. They may not actually have the background to help you see that. So more often than not, the first answer you're going to get from a lobbyist is you can't do that. That's not possible, and they have a long list of reasons. For a lot of good reasons, we didn't start with our lobbyists. We started with public safety's vision, and then we brought professionals in on how to help us execute. If they told us it was impossible, they didn't last long around us because we didn't want to hear it.
So, Chris, let's turn to you right now, and let's talk a little bit about that process of taking this idea off the yellow pad, per se, that legal pad that we take so many notes on, and into full-blown legislative effort. What did that transition look like, and can you talk about some of the more critical relationships that were forged at this time?
Certainly, thanks, Martha. And everything that Jeff and Kevin said is absolutely spot on. And I laugh at some of the stories that we came across, particularly some of the arguments in the early days. But that said, just moving back to 2008, again, I benefited from this because a lot of folks had been invested and were working on this issue, and I had not. I've been doing other things. But after I took over the communication shop in San Jose and realized how important it was to the future of our profession and to all of public safety and how we were going to communicate and be more effective, I said, look, this needs more attention. That said, I met Chuck Dowd for the first time in the fall of 2008 at a major cities conference. Literally, from within the first 10 minutes I met the guy, I realized how many slings and arrows he had taken in New York City trying to advance an idea. And even for New York City, it was difficult. So we were able to get the Major City Chiefs Organization to pass a resolution basically asking the FCC not to auction off after the 2008 D block auction had failed, asked them not to go ahead and auction off. They did that in short order, and that gave us a little bit of breathing room. Then the next thing is, okay, get everybody in the same room. Most people in public safety, they know communications are important, but they don't know. You talk bandwidth, you talk D block. I mean, Ray Flynn used to say, hey, I thought the D block was the jail. He didn't know what it was and how important this was. So then it was, okay, how do we bring everybody together, recognizing we had just come off a pretty significant failure? get everybody in the same room. So I was tasked by major city chiefs as their representatives, sort of reach out to all the public safety organizations, get everybody in the same room. Now, recognize to that point in history, there really had not been a joint legislative effort on behalf of all of public safety. They're so, the disciplines are so parochial in how they approach things, or at least were. Everyone was asking and looking for their own interests. But it was my contention that, look, if everybody in public safety came together and stayed together, and we were clear on what we were asking for, I didn't think that the Congress of the United States could say no, even though they were saying no. All branches, the White House, everybody was saying you shouldn't, can't, don't do it, not worth your time. And the reality was, to JJ's point, is that, look, if you stay together and you're focused and you are believers and you think this is important for not just us, but for the public in the United States, that was the approach we took. We got everybody in the same room. The first meeting in April of 2009 was interesting, I will say that. And history will show that, you know, having everybody in the same room was really important, but just listening and see where people's concerns were. And then my question to them was, is this issue that important to all of us that we're willing to spend the next couple of years working on? And everybody said absolutely yes. So I say, given that, how do we move this forward? And the notion of this first principles document came out, and that was, let us list out the things that are very, very critically important to us, things that we will not waver from. Recognize it has to be a relatively short list, you know, between 7 to 8 items, because there are a lot of things, as Dick had mentioned earlier, that other people were going to decide. We just had to, you know, the federal government was investing billions of dollars in money and spectrum. They will be able to touch certain pieces. The vendor community will be able to touch certain pieces, but we needed to be clear on what was important to us. And if we stayed together, we could get it. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. We then went on an educational campaign to say, this is what we think is important. We brought along a lot of colleagues. First of all, I met some of the best friends that I have, in the sense that they were all very committed, very professional and focused. And when you have a team like that, you can't go wrong. And again, I've referred to it as lightning in a bottle. I don't know if ever we could come up with the same scenario again. And for those in different countries and other places that are trying an effort like this, you need to have people that are willing to commit time, effort, and be willing to compromise. Sometimes that's tough. Check your ego at the door was mentioned earlier. I think that's important. But at the end of the day, when you're trying to lead large organizations or representatives of large organizations, it's about consensus. And sometimes that's viewed as a dirty word. In this case, it's not. It is getting people to a point where everybody agrees on a point so they don't split off. Or at a minimum, they're not going to object to it publicly. We can argue all we want inside the room, which we did, and came up with a core set of principles that we could all agree on, and then went from there. And to Kevin's point, I was a little shocked myself that we were able to pull that off over 3 years to make it happen, and still doing it. But that's good faith, hard work, and just a notion that, you know, I think that people understand we're not trying to profit from this. All we're trying to do is make sure that the right thing happens for public safety. So at the end of the day, public safety stayed united. We had first principles that we stayed consistent with. Everybody did such a great job. I mean, I get a lot of credit for this. I don't deserve it, quite frankly. It's the other folks as part of the team that made this happen. There were things happening that we had asked to happen that I thought we would have to deal with 3 months down the road. Come back the next week on our weekly call, and all of a sudden they were done. I didn't have to say anything. They just did it because they knew it was the right thing to do. So anyway, I'll leave it there to say that for those folks who think that something can't be done, it's too big, it's too audacious, break it down, get people on board, start focusing and educating the community as well as those in the legislative branch. Next thing you know, people start to turn your way, and you reach a critical mass, and then all of a sudden good things happen. But you have to have an end in mind, you have to have a vision, and then you take it from there.
So I want to say something, Martha, that Chris cannot say or would not, because he's a modest person. It isn't just about picking a leader. Chris Moore, as the leader of the Public Safety Alliance, that his gift was that he had a very small ego as it related to having to be right, and he was good about drawing us out. And we're public safety people, so let's face it, worldwide we have opinions, we're strong in our convictions, and we're extremely capable of voicing that. And Chris was probably the one person on our team that had the patience to listen to it, had a demeanor to settle it down. And I guess why I say that is, it's really easy to say, well, the smartest person in the room that understands this the best is going to be the best leader for the effort. And the reality is, my experience is, it actually takes someone with a lot of patience and the ability to work with a bunch of strong-willed people. We were all strong-willed people, and Chris just had a gift of just how to draw the most of it, the best of it out of us. And he was also very capable on his feet. He could debate with anybody, and he's a cop, so he could get as tough as he needed to be, pull out his verbal nightstick. He could do it, but it wasn't his go-to style, and it was really critical.
Yeah, and that
Jeff,
really
he's the 6'10" cop.
Yeah, exactly.
Stature played no role.
Very
Stature
soft spoken.
Yeah.
And I just really want to again drive this point home. First of all, listening to you all talk, it is clear that these are lifetime friendships, and it's funny because I relate it to a marriage that withstands building a house from the ground up. Because you guys found a way to listen, compromise, and optimize, right? And the first principles document, I think, is a really great piece of advice for people, because if you don't create that North Star, if you don't set that course so that everybody knows what that desired outcome is, what that common purpose is, it's really, really easy for those conversations to get derailed. So I think that was a really great point. And so when we start talking about building the coalitions, Kevin, I'm going to bring you into the conversation a little bit on this, because I want you to talk a little bit about engaging that EMS community nationwide. And one of the reasons I really think this is important goes back to the previous session when we started talking about how important it was to put our arms around those rural communities, those areas that are out on the outskirts or way out and beyond our urban environment, which is where a lot of those EMS professionals work. Can you talk a little bit about your role in engaging that community?
Sure. And one thing I'd say sort of in advance of that, it's one thing for people like Chris and Jeff and I who know the issue really well and know what we're going to gain, what we're going to lose as a result of the legislation, to go across Capitol Hill and sit with staff of the members and try and convince them that we're right. You get a response, they're receptive in some cases, number of cases. But it was when I went to the main delegation, my own delegation, and had the same conversation, and then started talking about, well, what about that car crash in Calais, or up in Caribou when an airplane crashes, or a heart attack in Dover Foxcroft, that they really got it and they connected and started talking about how FirstNet or the Public Safety Broadband Network could make that response so much more efficient and effective. They really got it. And so I can't underscore enough how important it is that we not be the faces, even though we represent associations, that go to these offices, that we use our association contacts to get the right people
Excellent.
in the right congressional districts and the right states in front of the right members with the right story. And none of that is easy because, first of all, you have to go back to your community, in my case, the EMS community, and go to that rural community chief in North Dakota or wherever, and tell them why FirstNet is great or why broadband would be great for him in North Dakota. Because our story generally was priority and preemption. In North Dakota, priority and preemption doesn't matter. They got all the bandwidth they want in North Dakota. That ain't it. It's just having coverage. And so, you have to tell the story just a little bit differently. And then once they're convinced and can go, then feel like they're able to go talk to their delegation, it's giving them the story from the EMS side, in my case, and that includes the wow kinds of parts of the story. Yes, it is saying, well, the average 13-year-old has more communications power in their left hand than any policeman, firefighter, or paramedic in the United States. That was our general theme, and that's great. But in EMSizing it for my community, we said, look, hit them with the golden hour. The golden hour is the time from the point in time when somebody in a car crash, say, suffers what's going to be a fatal injury until the last moment that a surgeon can get in there and fix it so they don't die. And, so you set up that part of the story. And then you say, with FirstNet or broadband, we can have advanced automatic crash notification go right from the moment that a car crashes and sends all of the data out on OnStar or whatever it is, saying how bad the crash is and how likely somebody's going to be severely injured in it. And rather than going through a whole bunch of operators at call centers, goes right to the smartphone in the ambulance. You just cut out 40 minutes of discovering that the car crash happened, of having somebody go out and determine that, yeah, this person's potentially fatally injured. Let's get the helicopter in here. And you save their lives. That's a wow moment. Another wow moment is saying, or we could give a portable ultrasound unit to a basic EMT in North Dakota who knows how to CPR and bandaging and splinting and not much else, like a paramedic, for instance, but can use that device with a doctor at a remote hospital to look at a car crash victim and say, you know, they need to get the helicopter. Or they don't need the helicopter, save the $30,000 and send them to the local hospital. That's good for everybody. But those are the kind of wow stories that legislators and their staffs like to hear. And you've got to equip your community with those before they go and talk to them. So,
well, and sorry, go ahead.
Well, that's it. No, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, because what I was going to say, and this is such a great point, you know, we do focus a lot on everybody's effort up on the Hill and everything that the committees that you all testified in front of, but getting down into that grassroots effort and engaging the constituency is so important, because really the interest lies with them ultimately, does it not, right? To the point of your stories. And so to be able to come at those legislative representatives from two angles, not only that subject matter expertise that you all bring to the table, but that strong constituency interest is such a great point, Chief, and I appreciate you bringing that up. Did anybody else want to add anything on that element, or should we?
Let me just add one thing. And again, as many things that we did right, there were a number of things that we didn't do well, and we were told many times that to basically go away, that you guys lost, go away. And we were frankly not experienced enough. We're all police chiefs and fire chiefs and EMS chiefs. People tell you to go away. You're like, that's not the way we operate. This is important. We move forward. It took, quite frankly, an earthquake, an act of God that came just at the right time. We told them, hey, the commercial networks just aren't resilient enough for us. And it's not that they go down, but they become saturated. And right when we need them most, at a hurricane or an earthquake or something. Just right when we thought we were at the lowest point, an earthquake happened on the East Coast. A rarity. In California, we see them all the time, the West Coast. And basically went south to north. And basically the networks just became instantly saturated. The people in DC thought there was a bomb that went off. People are going, what happened? What happened? It was just a naturally occurring event. First responders could not get access to the network. It was the perfect demonstration, purely an act of God, purely luck at our lowest point, that's something like that happened. So you got to take advantage of those and say, look, this is exactly what we're talking about. And I tell you what, the opinions changed instantly, because they could see they were impacted directly by it. And mind you, we were in the middle of a recession, or the worldwide recession, into that period of 2009, 2010, and revenues were there, and say, we can't afford to do what you're asking us to do. And we came up with a business model that we said could be self-supporting, but it would require investment. So I said, sometimes it's just reacting to the scenario that's in front of you, whatever. And that's what public safety people do: is you take the facts in front of you and run with it, and do make your best decision.
So, and Chief, I want to actually talk about that very interesting phenomenon you brought up, right? Because clearly there is a lot of energy and a lot of sense of purpose after things go south, and we're all trying to fix what might not have been working at the time. But there's also this element of what's called felt need, creating the felt need. And sometimes you have to create that, not out of an earthquake, but you have to do basically what Chief McGinnis was talking about, and create that felt need out of maybe smaller examples and maybe what ifs at certain times and places. But there's a lot of historical events that you can draw on. So what I'm saying is, to the attendees here, you don't necessarily have to hope for an earthquake to happen to make your point. There are so many opportunities to draw on, unfortunately, what are catastrophic events around the globe, but to evaluate and measure and really look at what went wrong and how these types of networks could remedy that. I think those are really valuable points. And to that, I want to go into this next question, which really, I want to pin you guys down on some specific opposition that you were facing at the time. So I want to know exactly from inside and from out. So, you know, clearly there were some things that were going on internally with getting that coalition lockstep, and then there was opposition from the outside. Can you speak specifically to maybe one example that you each might have to that?
Well, let me get that kicked off. We had the initial friction where we didn't all agree, and we worked our way through that in private. So that was our first hurdle. Then the second thing, it's often missed, I think, by those of us in public safety. We're here to serve, and that's why we get up every day. But there are other people in the commercial sector whose entire corporate future is tied up in a space that we are talking about competing in. And they have an obligation, like we have a fiduciary obligation to the patient, they have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders. So when we come up with this idea for FirstNet, and it was going to completely ruin someone's business model in this segment, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to do everything they can to undermine us and not get caught at it. I mean, ideally, they don't want to fight with public safety. It's a bad look. So there was a lot of headwinds that we could never see which direction it was coming from. At anything, this is a 2-day seminar in and of itself. Right. You are going to gore someone's ox when you do something like this. You are. And you better understand what their motivations are and where they're going to come from. And you better find a way to the high ground or you're going to get beat. Public safety does not bring the kind of financial resources, lobbyists, experts, and a web of people whose supply chain depends on public safety losing this argument. They're going to be working the legislative process, and they're going to be extremely persuasive because they write big checks. So you are not always going to see who the enemy is, but they are predictable. And the first one's us, ourselves. The second was people that have a lot to lose by us being successful. And the third is failure to be able to convincingly paint a picture of the future. Those are your 3 barriers.
Did anybody want to add to that?
I think Jeff just said it the best that I've ever heard it said. That one little piece of that is when the more successful you become, because these people are good at it, they spend their careers trying to knock down people that are hurting their business model. We're a little more resilient. We're actually a lot more resilient. And the more resilient we became and more successful we became, those arrows started to come to something less personally. And at the end of the day, you just have to be, know that there's a consequence down the road for doing the right thing and stay true to it. And it worked out fine, but there's a lot of money out there, and they're very, and they have relationships on the Hill, and they were peddling bad arguments or poor, quite frankly, false arguments. But every time we were able to come in and tell them why it's important to public safety and why it's important to their families, not just us, but to their families and the people we serve every day.
Yeah, and Chief Johnson, one of the things that I think is really important that people need to take away is that as you build these coalitions, particularly within the context of the Public Safety Alliance, it is so important to hash out your differences in a closed room and then come out with a united front. Without that, that disjointed messaging is also going to clearly lead to the demise of any effort. So I just wanted to reiterate that point because I thought it was really well made. Okay, so let's. Oh, go ahead.
Martha, I want to lead into Kevin. I know Kevin has something to offer here, but I will tell you one of the biggest accidental secrets to our success, and this is not going to be flattering to us, but we had no idea that this was impossible. Make no mistake about it. This was impossible by any measure, by anyone that understands the legislative process. We were poorly funded. We didn't understand how it worked. But here's the thing that public safety has that works to our advantage. We're not good at quitting. We didn't know when to quit. And when we should have been intimidated and ran for the hills, we were too stupid to know it. And thank goodness. Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that, I remember myself saying, boy, it's an uphill battle. And I said that every day, day in, day out until February of 2012. And then suddenly I realized, we're there. Well, a new uphill battle then started, but at any rate, that was implementation. But I think one of the other things that you got to fight are the naysayers who plant no's. The no, you will never get this off the ground because the microchip makers will never make the chips for you because you're too small a portion of the market. You'll never get all of the governors to sign on to agree to use this. You'll never, and you just gotta never listen to the nevers.
Right. Well, and look
Excellent
at
point.
everybody. Yeah, and everybody's falling all over themselves now to serve public safety, where 10 years ago we were basically left to make do with whatever the commercial networks and the hardware and software developers were building for us. So there you go, proof and point. So I want to talk.
One,
Go ahead.
Martha, if I can't, just one anecdote that's just so good. I laugh because public safety communications was treated in such a way that, hey, you're just not that big, you're not that important to us, and they just shunted us off the side. And now we have, companies competing with Super Bowl commercials for public safety communications. Right. I love it. I think it's great.
Yeah, I mean, it is very funny to watch, right? And we kept telling them, no, this is important, and it took an act of Congress for them to believe it. So that's a good thing. So let's talk just a quickly.
There are now 200 FirstNet devices out there available on the market. 200 count.
Yeah, and we were worried about chips being made for us. So we are getting close to the end here, gentlemen. So I want to have you speak briefly to the importance and the strategy behind building the bipartisan support for this effort. Whichever one of you would like to take that. Chris, maybe?
I'll kick it off and just say this. We've sort of highlighted already is make sure that you have your own team and your own house in order before you start trying to educate somebody else, because it doesn't work. They're going to try and pick you off individually. Stay united. If you have good people, the leadership most of the time takes care of itself, because you're going to get what you need done. And just, again, stay united, stay focused. You will survive. You will thrive.
Kevin made a good point to append that. Kevin made a good point about, all politics are local. So listen, I live in the state of Oregon here in the United States, and if we had a committee chair or a vice chair of a committee, then we would make the initial engagement with them. But the next time they heard, it was from the fire chiefs in their home district and the police chiefs from their home district. That they're more concerned about what people from their home area think of their performance than they are a group of people they'll never see again. So right. I think we did that so many times with mixed success, but in the end, ultimately successful. But you have to engage your local police chief, fire chief, and EMS chief.
Fabulous. I'm going to finish with one quick question here. When drafting the legislation, what role did you all actually play in that language? And were any of the first principle document items actually drafted into that legislation and now placed into law?
So truth be told, again, we focused on our first principles and a whole lot of discussions. The folks on the Hill actually drafted the legislation itself. And then we went back and forth on their drafts, making sure that what we thought was needed. And then, I mean, we got into the weeds on a number of things that Dick talked about earlier, which is, governance. And I can't underestimate or underemphasize the need for governance. Money and spectrum is hard enough, but who's going to run it, how it's going to be run, a lot of that just needed to be done. But I will say that the vast majority of the things, if I could say all of them are in there, but they weren't. There were a couple of small things that we were able to live without. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of things on our first principles document certainly made it into the legislation and are now in law.
Which is such an incredible accomplishment. Again, I'm always awe-inspired working with all of you that were part of this initial effort and our ongoing effort to promote FirstNet and make sure everybody is optimizing this very hard fought network. So what an incredible story. And thank you all for sharing your experiences and your insights. In our next session, we will discuss what happened once that law was on the books. So stay with us as we move into our panel discussion on standing up the FirstNet Authority. Thanks again, gentlemen. The ink is now dry on the statute. The law is on the books. Let's talk about what happened next. Welcome to Session 3, Standing Up the FirstNet Authority. Joining us for this session are Ed Parkinson, Chief Executive Officer for FirstNet, Jeff Bratcher, Chief Technology Officer for FirstNet, and Sue Swenson, former FirstNet Board Chair. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. Ed, I'm going to start with you. I'm hoping that maybe you'd be willing to share some of your background and talk about some of the key roles that you've played in all aspects of the D-Block effort and then FirstNet.
Well, thanks, Martha. It's good to see you all, and it's good to be here today. So thanks to everyone who's listening in, taking time out of your days. I was very fortunate in that I sort of fell into a wonderful opportunity working on Capitol Hill for then Chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, Peter T. King from New York. And Chairman King was instrumental in really, he was the catalyst, if anything else, for the reallocation of the D-Block to public safety and frankly, the creation of FirstNet. He was very close to the NYPD, the NYFD over his many years serving in Congress and representing Norfolk and Suffolk County on Long Island. And that was a key component of the work that I was involved in when I worked on Capitol Hill. We would engage a lot with not only the NYPD and public safety from the city, but also with all national groups. Pete was a huge supporter of the firefighter community, was the chair of the Fire Caucus in Congress, and that exposed me to the community. And I think it's safe to say, once you've actually been touched by public safety in any way, I know many of you listening today are from the community, maybe some of you are involved in the industry, some of you have family members, but the minute you are touched by public safety, you can't help but be hooked by the men and women who actually run towards the fire, run towards the danger. And, I felt very fortunate being put in that position, working in Congress, and I was approached by a number of public safety groups in terms of trying to solve communications issues, especially in a broadband ecosystem. And working with public safety, we were able to initiate the process, really, which is probably the best way to describe it, a long and arduous task to get anything through Congress. But this was one of those things that just made sense right from the word go for a majority of the men and women who serve up there. So working in Congress, I was able to be part of the efforts to reallocate the D-Block for FirstNet and ultimately the creation of FirstNet itself. So it's been a long time, I suppose. I've been with the organization now coming up 8 years, and if you take into account the 3 or 4 years I was working on the issue on Capitol Hill, it's my other family, I suppose, is a good way of describing it.
Well, clearly you've been an asset to the effort. Can you talk just a little bit more specifically about the work that you were actually engaged in during the formative years of FirstNet prior to the signing of the bill?
Absolutely. So there was a piece of legislation, if my memory serves me right, it was HR 5086, 5096 possibly. It's been a long time since I had to remember that number. But that was really the first piece of legislation that my boss introduced, which really called for the creation of FirstNet, the allocation of funding and the dedication of the D-Block spectrum to public safety. And so that went into, we started drumming up co-sponsors. That was the catalyst again that public safety was able to coalesce around, which really started the movement. And through coordination with Senator Rockefeller's office, Senator McCain's office, Senator Lieberman, as well as a myriad of House members, I think we were knocking 100 co-sponsors to that legislation when eventually was picked up by Energy and Commerce, we were able to shepherd that through. So I remember running left, right, and center all around the House of Representatives and going through the Capitol to the Senate side to try and find supporters for this legislation. Now acting FCC Commissioner Joyce Rosenworcel, she was Senator Rockefeller's chief lead on this particular topic and all things telecom. She got my boss, Pete King, to testify before the Senate on a hearing on this matter. So a lot of good bipartisan, bicameral support for this issue. And I think that was something to be part of, was a special moment, especially in my early career.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point. Can you talk about why it's so critical to have that bipartisan support for something of this magnitude?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really accomplish anything that's worth doing without the buy-in from both sides. But I'd almost take that one step further, Martha. The message of the reallocation of the D-Block to public safety was one of the first times that the various disciplines of public safety, police, law enforcement, fire, EMS, 911, emergency managers, and keep on going, had coalesced around a single issue that they all agreed on. They knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and to bring together the various disciplines of public safety was almost a bigger deal than finding a bipartisan issue that you could get members of Congress around. So that in itself, I think the public safety leaders of the associations and the groups who were involved in that process deserve all the credit, right? Because without their input and without that leadership coming from public safety, because they were the ones who lobbied Congress, they were the ones who pushed this through, when they were the ones, when they were told no, they wouldn't take no for an answer. So the credit is all public safety's to actually get us to the point where Congress passed legislation.
Well, and forgive me for giggling, just having come up through the ranks in the fire department. I completely and totally understand the significance of that coalition being built. And the prior session that we just had, we had a really great discussion on what was so critical about that, and how hashing out the differences in private and coming up with that common message going forward was so critical to the success of the effort. So yeah, I totally and completely understand that. So going back again to securing the D block, can you cite any specific critical elements of that effort that you would say were maybe linchpins to the success?
Well, they're the leaders that I talked about, and many of us on the call know exactly who they are. And without going down the list of names, because I'll definitely miss some out, I don't want to leave folks off the list. It came down to the leadership shown by the associations, and there are a few folks who are no longer with us who were part of that effort. And when you think of the national need that FirstNet does provide a service for, but then the reach of the associations, the reach of also the private sector partners who really were supportive of the effort to get the D block reallocated to public safety, and then of course the political leadership that it took. Initially this was an unpopular piece of legislation. There wasn't a lot of leadership support for this, but again, it just is the testimony to public safety and their ability to really illustrate the vital need of a network like FirstNet and the vision that we could provide. That took a lot of leadership from the public safety leaders from across the nation. So there's a lot of credit to go around here, and I think that's the most important part. It's not about those of us really on doing the presentation today. It was about the leaders of public safety who stepped up to make sure that this happened.
Well, and I love that you really have now captured the essence of that three-prong approach, right? The public safety representation, the government, and the private sector. And of course, Sue will be able to speak to many aspects of that private sector outreach and what the critical elements were were in just a minute or two. I just want to talk quickly about your work with the Government Affairs Office for FirstNet. There was really some critical legwork that was done at this point. Can you talk a little bit about your engagement, the 56 states, territories, and DC opting in? What was opting in? Why was it so critical? And what was the threshold to success of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate enough to, I think being the third or fourth, I think I beat Jeff Bratcher by sheer weeks, or maybe it was a month or two, in joining the FirstNet Authority. So I was lucky enough to be brought in to run the government affairs piece, and the opt-in, opt-out decision was really the number one priority that we needed to do. Upon the signing of a public-private partner, and ultimately that became AT&T, the FirstNet Authority, along with our partner, had the responsibility to go and meet with public safety in every single state, and ultimately with the governor of every single state, and provide a plan for what the network would look like in Maine and California and Alaska and American Samoa. And that individual, she or he, had a decision to make, to either choose to opt in, which meant passing the risk of deployment, operation, and maintenance of the radio access network in that state over to FirstNet and AT&T, or that state could opt out, and that meant assuming all the aforementioned risk and then plugging in into an interoperable nationwide system. And so we spent, once the contract was signed with AT&T in March of 17, that really kickstarted a clock. And we had really until the end of the year, December 29th. And I can still vividly remember where I was that day when we got the final governor. We got word that Governor Brown of California had chosen to opt in. But we ran the table, and it was a Herculean effort, right? Not only from AT&T's behalf, but if you look inside of the FirstNet Authority, Government Affairs, yes, we were sort of the ones behind the scene, in front of governors and elected officials. But, we had our market engagement team, Dave Buchanan, who was ably leading that organization. We had Rich Reed, who was also heavily involved in the state consultation work. It takes a village, you can't just, it's never just one small group of people, right? It's the collective. And I think that's the power of the FirstNet Authority. It really brought in the public safety input and the public safety support internally of each individual state, saying we've got to opt in. It's the smart decision. It took the power, if you will, and the reach of an AT&T, who is has been involved in these states and territories for decades and decades and decades, right, before the authority came in. But then it's that independent voice, right? It's that independent public safety voice of the FirstNet Authority that really rammed home the ability that we provide that oversight over AT&T, yet we are the voice for public safety. And incorporating all of that, proofs in the pudding with Governor McAuliffe in Virginia being the first governor to opt in, and then concluding with Governor Brown in California about 4 or 5 months later. It was an intense 2017. I think anyone involved in that, my wife especially, I didn't see too much of her at the time. So
an arduous 4 months, I'm sure. So you mentioned Jeff's role, and I'm going to bring you into this, Jeff. Let's have you introduce yourself a little bit and talk about how you got involved in this effort and what your roles and responsibilities were in the early phases of standing up, first of all, securing the D block, and then consequently standing up FirstNet.
Sure thing, Martha, and thank you for having me today. It's great to see former Chairwoman Sue Swinson as well on the call. It's been too long. My involvement goes back to around 2003. That's when I started in Boulder at the Department of Commerce Labs and really focused in public safety communications, initially on the land mobile radio P25 standards, but also working with all the major public safety associations, the NIPSTICs, APCOs, and others as their realignment of the 700 megahertz band that had been set aside for predominantly narrowband communications. That was underwent a realignment, and they actually moved the narrowband to the upper part of the band, and then the broadband was left as that allocation in that D block portion. So that's when kicked off in 2005, 2006 timeframe. So actually predates FirstNet by quite a bit. And that progressed through, as Ed alluded to. This was right after 9/11 as well. There was a strong focus on interoperable communications for public safety. Lots of efforts through the SAFECOM program, Department of Justice, and several other key agencies that were driving these grants in interoperable communications. As that broadband spectrum, and I like to recall the 2008 launch of the iPhone. That really changed the game in my mind for broadband communications. And I had spent the previous 10 years in the vendor community at Motorola and Siemens doing cellular broadband and cellular network deployments worldwide. So we saw that coming and started leveraging that with public safety as they started realizing, hey, we're going to need broadband communications as a key component of our response capabilities. It made total sense. The problem was they could not rely on the commercial networks at the time that would not offer the priority and preemption capability they needed. So fast forward, there was the initial going with the Public Safety Spectrum Trust and the D block and trying to attract a partner to do that via the FCC auction process. That ultimately did not result in a valid bid, I would say, for that spectrum. So that's when the legislation, as Ed alluded to, really gained steam. As Vice Chair Johnson always says, it's one of the first times that you had all the disciplines come together and be in full alignment. Here's what we need, Congress. Please get us the spectrum so that we can ultimately have the FirstNet authority and move that forward. And we did a lot of work within the Public Safety Communications Research Program early on. We actually did a demonstration network on the 10 megahertz of spectrum just to show the validity of broadband communications and what public safety could leverage it for. There was a lot of debate within public safety communications at that time. Should it be LTE or should it be WiMAX, believe it or not? And ultimately, public safety said, we need to focus and do LTE. That's the future path for these wireless networks worldwide. So we're proud of a lot of the efforts we did to understand the technology and bring that training to public safety. And then I had the opportunity to join the authority as they were standing up their personnel after the legislation. And I joined right before Thanksgiving in 2013 is when I joined. And to Ed's point, I think he predated me by a couple of months. We had seen each other, I think, at APCO that year. Full steam ahead from there. So very honored to be a part of it. It's been many years now looking back, but it feels like a short amount of time. But very happy with the tremendous growth and progress that we're seeing on the FirstNet network today.
And Jeff, of course, you bring that critical element, right, of the tech speak. You always have to have somebody that really, really understands that the underpinning of that network itself and the value add between one spectrum versus another. So I'm sure your insights were very valuable during that time frame. I want you to maybe reflect a little bit on some of the challenges that you might have been up against in promoting the message that you were trying to get out there at various stages of your engagement, whether it was trying to secure the D block or maybe in your early stages, once FirstNet was stood up, maybe that's a better place to focus right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Some of the early challenges, and back at the time working with Anna Gomez, who was leading NTIA at the time as well and helping craft the legislation, we were providing a lot of that technical speak behind the scenes as they developed and worked on and refined this legislation. Public safety critically recognized this was a fantastic block of spectrum. It did have a few incumbents in it, but that, trying to get the full band, the 20 megahertz allocated for a nationwide network was instrumental in that. And to your point, we really looked at it from the technical side, and myself specifically, translating public safety's needs. They don't need to worry about what the technology is or the bits and bytes. They just need to explain their needs and let us then build that into what we were doing. And the earliest challenge, I'll be honest, and Sue may have been in the meeting, I can't recall, we had a big meeting at the Department of Commerce downtown in DC and had all the carriers come in. And this was leading up to getting the legislation passed. And they all stood up and said, we will not provide priority preemption to public safety users on our networks. We just don't feel we can make those cases to our boards and make that a successful option. So that was an early challenge. And that's what I think really resolved public safety. We have to get legislation to make this happen, have a single entity and the authority driving this and developing that business model with the public-private partnership to make this happen.
Okay, and that's a great segue into my next question for you, and then we're going to draw Sue into this conversation. So clearly, the engagement was redlined, right? You guys were all over the country. You're talking to political figures and influencers. You're talking to first responders and their leadership, who, of course, were instrumental in rallying their own representatives behind this. So what were some of the greatest lessons that you felt were learned in structuring how this network was going to look? In addition to that, building that RFP language, what were some of the greatest things that those first responders contributed to building that framework?
Yeah, great question, Martha. And it goes back to my needs comment. What do they need? They really needed to rely on the network when they needed it. In times of congestion, they've got to be able to rely on that. And that's what some of the key estimates were. Key feedback that we learned across all 56 states and territories, as well as we have coverage needs that don't always align to a commercial business case for a wireless carrier. As Sue well knows with her background, and I'm sure she'll allude to this, you don't just build a tower if you can't make money and cover the cost of that tower and all the associated long operational costs. So we learned a lot of insight about where they needed coverage that wasn't really there today. The other key challenge I'll go back to is we didn't yet have our full funding from the legislation. Again, we were told you will get the funding from future spectrum auctions. So we were doing a lot of work on a borrowed $2 billion from the Treasury that we were allocated to get up and running. And Sue may allude to this as well. We also had a challenge from Penny Pritzker at the time, who was leading the department. You got to get this done, and you got to give me a timeline and a roadmap and how much money it's going to take to get this RFP out the door. So we had all that going behind the scenes and consultation, people flying everywhere, a lot of work with the board that was in place at the time as well, doing that and supporting it. And it was really documenting those needs and driving that into an RFP and working with the board to figure out what does the business model look like that will make this successful in the long term? Because $7 billion is all you're getting. We had $6.5 billion to put on the contract. How do we make this successful and viable for public safety long term?
Yeah, all excellent points. So Sue, let's bring you into the conversation. Would you just take a moment to introduce yourself, give us a little bit of your background, and how did you become involved with the FirstNet effort?
Sure. Happy to be here today, and thanks everybody for joining. This is great to talk about this. Great to see you, Ed and Jeff. We're sort of family. Once you're, like Ed said, once you're with public safety, you're with them forever. And I feel that same way about the FirstNet Authority, having spent the first, period of time there. But I spent my career in telecom, both wireline and wireless, and so brought that experience to the board. And how I got involved was, I think, destiny or serendipity. I'm not sure how you want to call it, but our first chair, actually, I worked for during my career. And he called me one day and said, "Hey, I'm getting involved in something that sounds pretty interesting. Maybe you'd be interested. But I can't really tell you much about it, so you'll have to talk to the Assistant Secretary of Commerce to hear about it." So Larry Strickling was the Assistant Secretary at the time, and talked to him, and I said, "Yeah, sounds great." Now, I don't think he fully disclosed all those challenges that might have presented itself. It's probably a good thing, but I can tell you that it's probably been the most rewarding experience of my entire career. So I'm really happy that it happened, and glad to still be involved in public safety, as you know, Martha.
Well, you're a strong contributor, Sue, and we really do appreciate your ongoing support and influence for sure. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about when you, and forgive me, when you first got on the board, were you immediately the chair, or were you working as one of the board members?
Yeah, no, I came on as an inaugural board member, and Sam Ginn was the chair at that time. So,
Okay.
so you know, it was an interesting structure, and I think Congress deserves a lot of credit for the way they structured the board in terms of the type of people they had on it. If you look at the legislation, it's very prescriptive in terms of public safety representation, local and state representation, but they also wanted people who had actually designed, built, and operated networks and had financial background. So they were very insightful, I think, to bring that group together. Now, I will tell you, and Jeff remembers this, we had our first introductory meeting in Boulder. And so I think there was a little bit of, I think it's called storming, norming, and forming, Jeff, going on there, you know, kind of looking across the table and saying, who are these people? Who are those evil carrier people, you know? And so we've come a long way since that time. And as you know, to this day, we have great relationships. So that was an important part of the structure. And I think having that background and that combination is what helped bring that work. But I also think in terms of the framework too, is how we thought about building the organization. It sits inside of NTIA Commerce. It's an independent authority within that entity, but we wanted to structure it much like a private sector company. So even though we complied with federal rules, regulations, the FAR, personnel, all of those kinds of things, we wanted to design it just like a public company, because a lot of the interaction, very important interaction, was with the industry. So Ed, as a CEO, can interact then with CEOs around the industry. Jeff, as a CTO, instead of, you know, the government uses some titles that are sometimes not very well understood by the public, you know, the private and public companies. So I think those two elements around the structure were really critical to its overall success. And I think to this day, it continues to serve, it serves the organization well.
Oh yeah, building in that inherent familiarity, correct? I mean, just the nomenclature alone makes that familiarity open and more inviting to engage with, I'm sure. So brilliant, really brilliant in the framing of that. So let's talk about
Martha.
Yes,
I was going to interject. I remember
Please.
that first meeting fondly, Sue, and it was definitely the public safety folks on one side, industry on the other, kind of gauging each other, understanding, all right, what are we in here?
Yeah, and it's and now we're best friends. You know, I think it's you know, it's really interesting how that evolved over time, because I think it became very symbiotic in terms of the private, you know, the wireless people, you know, the industry people couldn't have done it without public safety, and I think public safety felt the same way. So it really became a very tight relationship, and which made it work. It was a very tight knit board.
Well, and what I love what you just said, because clearly these friendships are long lasting, and it's that human interaction, right? It's so easy to forgive the word, but vilify somebody or something, an entity, when they're over there. But you know, bringing everybody into the room and really breaking down those barriers and fleshing out what that common purpose is. I mean, who wouldn't want to make sure that first responders have that unfettered ability to communicate, right? I mean, who wouldn't want that? I mean, everybody's a citizen. Everybody has those services provided to them. So it's such a great point to be made that there's no substitution for that human interaction and engagement. So thank you for putting that in. So Ed, did you want to add anything to that particular topic about the breaking down those barriers and overcoming some of that pushback?
one of the things, and I've learned an awful lot from the respective chairs, Tip Alter-Taylor, who sits in the current chair, Horowitz, Sue, and Sam. The one consistent thing I've always heard is culture and how important culture is. It makes or breaks an organization. I think what's interesting, Sue's alluded to the fact that you had two incredibly different cultures colliding in that first meeting. And our job was to integrate public safety's culture into whatever we did at FirstNet, from how we would speak to folks, how we would think about business models, how we would explain and engage with people. And I think that's the key aspect of what we ultimately were successful in doing. This isn't anyone's network other than public safety's, and you can feel public safety's influence at every aspect of what we do. And I think that comes back down to the cultural aspect that we work so hard to develop at the onset, and we still work very, very hard to maintain.
Let me add on, Martha, if I can. I think Ed raised a really important point. Chief Johnson and I became the chair, to your earlier question, I became the chair in 2014 when Sam didn't continue along with FirstNet. So I became the chair and Chief Johnson became the vice chair. We created a very strong partnership, and to Ed's point, culture is really important, and part of it was showing that really was a partnership between the industry and public safety. We went on a roadshow for several months and literally went around the country together and met with the different organizations and talked to them about what our intentions were, kind of what the plan is, opened ourselves up to lots of questions. And frankly, one of the biggest concerns I think about public safety is that this was going to be too government-esque. They were concerned about it being driven, and so they, one, thought it would take forever, two, that they really wouldn't have input into it. So those interactions were critically important to build the credibility to say, no, this is your network, to Ed's point, and this is how we're going to do it. And of course, we needed to demonstrate that with action, but I think that did a lot to solidify the support of the organizations around the country when I think they were somewhat skeptical. I also think early on, Martha, that I think public safety had a view that they wanted to build their own network. I think Jeff remembers this. We're going to do it greenfield. And I said, well, you can, but you'll all be dead before it's done. So we need to think about it a different way. So, again, that back and forth, that collaboration, and building that trust over time is what allowed us to be where we are today. I know Jeff remembers that debate.
Absolutely. I'll add a little to that, Sue. It's a great point that to the, public safety had always built and owned their land mobile radio networks locally. And here you now have this federal agency that's been awarded their spectrum and $7 billion to build it on their behalf. So you're starting behind the 8 ball in that message already, to Sue's point. And that roadshow went a long way. I recall TJ Kennedy as well at the time spending lots of time explaining, look, yes, it's a federal authority, but we're here driven by our board, which is comprised of industry and public safety, to again focus on what public safety needs in the network. And it was a great discussions all over the country, understanding those needs. But it took time, to Ed's point on culture, gaining that trust that we weren't just a federal program. This is not a federal network. This is a state and local network built with FCC spectrum, not NTIA federal spectrum. So those messages were, it took us some time to deliver that and get the local public safety agencies to understand, no, you can't build it on your own. And Sue, you'll remember this. I remember Tim Bryan, right? Every meeting, how are you going to fill the hole? Right? What's the business model? How do we make this work for 25 years or 30 years, going forward?
Yeah. Well, just to add on to that too, I'm sorry to, interrupt, but this is we're reliving that time. I think what makes the FirstNet Authority unique is that, and we haven't said it explicitly, and we take it for granted, is that the funding is not appropriated in annual budgeting. They have the funding ongoing, and it has to be self-sustaining. So that makes it very, very unique in that perspective. So that self-sufficiency around the independence, early on, and Ed and Jeff remember this very well, NTIA did a great job of supporting the organization as we were standing it up in terms of providing personnel support, a lot of other support. But over time, we brought those functions inside. So the FirstNet Authority is not only independent, but it's self-sustaining and self-sufficient. So I think it's important to understand that uniqueness about the organization.
Oh yeah, very, very much so. I agree. And again, just listening to you all talk, it's really fun because there's this great representation and filling in the blanks. And this is what public safety wanted. So they wanted to stand up their own network. And you're like, well, that's not really logical. And here, let's show you the technological aspect of what this looks like. So, I mean, honestly, I think one of my favorite expressions is the one that Chris Moore uses when he says that we essentially caught lightning in a bottle. And what we're trying to do today is really help others that are interested in capturing that lightning as well within the context of their own limitations and advantages. How can this be replicated, right? So let's move into the discussion about building this RFP, because clearly this is a behemoth undertaking. Sue, can you talk just a little bit about the process and the objective-driven structure of the document?
Sure, and I'll look to Jeff and Ed to add color commentary because it was a team effort. Clearly how we did it was really important. I mean, there's RFPs and then there's RFPs, and most of the RFPs that come out of the federal government that Jeff and Ed know are requirements based. I mean, you want a pencil with this kind of lead, and you want paper that looks like this, you want a jet that looks like this, and here's the parts you need. But we were building something that had never been done before. It's just like, we're not exactly sure what this is going to look like, but we got help externally from FirstNet at the time because we did not have that procurement capability. So we worked with the Department of Interior, great resources there. We worked with other people as well. And we came to the decision that we should do an objectives-based RFP. And we had 16 objectives, and I won't belabor them. We can certainly provide this to the listeners, but things like financial sustainability was one of the characteristics of it. User adoption was really important in the first responder community, because if we weren't careful, the person who won the award could come and build customers, but first responders wouldn't benefit. So we had to clarify that. The application ecosystem was really important. Obviously, as Jeff said, public safety had voice communications, but we were moving into broadband. So the applications ecosystem to provide applications that were specific to public safety was critically important. I can go on and on, but innovation was really the key here. And so we wanted to design an RFP that allowed interested parties to come and collaborate and partner with others, because not one company could do everything we were asking. And so we went out and actually talked to all those interested parties and met with them individually, answered questions, of course, with the appropriate lawyers in tow, because we always had a lot of lawyers involved in this, because we obviously had to comply with federal regulations on how we did that. But it felt like a sort of a typical RFP process, and not one that's like, here's the document, just respond. A lot of interaction back and forth, and also FirstNet Authority, when TJ Kennedy was there and Jeff and Ed were involved in this, we had analyst meetings. I mean, with analysts in the industry. I mean, how unusual is that because people were confused about what is this and what's the value of this? Well, 20 megahertz of spectrum, for those of us who are from the industry, is worth a lot. And so we wanted to make sure that people do that. So it felt very, like I said, it wasn't the typical government approach. And I think as a result, we not only got the best responses and were able to evaluate objectively our decision, but as a result of this, we were able to defend a protest that you normally get out of RFPs and awards like this. And so after about 3 months, we were able to win that process. So I'll let Jeff and Ed add to it, but that's my perspective on it. It was very different, but very successful. And I think it's a model now within the federal government for other types of big projects, but they may have something to add.
Can I turn to Ed really quick? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sure, I just because I really want to know from your perspective, Ed, current CEO, looking at this objective-based model. How do you feel that impacts your job right now in advancing the innovation that Sue had referenced, having that as that foundational element that, because eventually that's also the framework of the contract. Am I correct?
Yeah, you're exactly on the right track, Martha. To be honest, I think if we had done it differently, we wouldn't have the flexibility that we have now, not only to engage with AT&T, our partner, but frankly, to engage with the marketplace. One of the most exciting things that we've seen over the past 4 years since the network's being started to be deployed to where we are today has been the increase in innovation, the different form factors, both in terms of assets that are out there. I mean, you just look in the last 6 months, we were the world's first telecommunications network to bring Z-axis location to the end user, a world first. We now have high-powered user equipment, again, a world first dedicated on band 14. This is the kind that provides much greater range extension. Jeff can really speak far more intelligently than I on those, but what it really does, it allows for greater flexibility to engage with the marketplace, to identify different aspects that is available of technologies and tools that are available in the commercial marketplace and make them available to public safety. And we're starting to see that now, not only here in the United States, but globally. As more and more nations are looking to deploy networks, we've got ESN in the UK, we've got SafeNet in South Korea, and many others are starting to look at this. The public safety broadband marketplace is growing exponentially. So I know, Jeff, you've probably got some additional thoughts there.
Sure thing, Ed. I think Sue captured it accurately as we're trying to build an RFP. We also did 13 RFIs out to industry. I mean, we were very transparent in getting advice from anyone that would be interested in this, as well as 2 industry days. And we had all the major carriers contribute and provide their thinking and some of the interpretations of the legislation that we had as well. So it was and keep in mind, we also were waiting on the funding. We did not yet have all of our funding to put on the contract. So it was a very interesting, lots of sleepless nights by a lot of us. Are we going to get the funding out of the spectrum? That wound up being a non-worry with the AWS-3, just blew it out of the water with that auction. We had our full funding. And again, I think it's a testament to the board that we had with public safety and industry. They said, look, federal government, don't do what you always do. Don't try and do 10,000 requirements. Let the industry do what they do. Let them innovate. Tell them what you're trying to do. And fortunately, our consultation helped us greatly refine those objectives into what was the critical components, those 16 objectives we needed to ensure were built into this.
Which ties back into our earlier conversation, Jeff, with your engagement with public safety and really drawing out what their critical needs are. And Ed, I love the depiction of the ever-growing public safety market, because everybody knows clearly before FirstNet, and this was stated on another webinar I was watching the other day, public safety essentially had to bend to the will of the commercial carrier's profit model, right? So I love the way that this woman put that, because it was true. I mean, I was there, I was a first responder. And so to have this really tectonic paradigm shift of the public servant all of a sudden becoming that primary focal point is really remarkable and long due, I think. So we're getting close to the end. Sue, I want to turn to you for just a moment. Let's talk about transitioning now and really engaging that private sector partner. Can you speak to your experience? Let's take it from that meeting and what was involved in kind of vetting that whole process out and getting the buy-in.
Well, like I said, we had a lot of discussions even during the RFP process with everyone. So I think having the board's involvement in that, and the board was very involved. I mean, it was full participation by the board in those meetings, which I think helped to engage that particular industry in the discussion, because you were talking with people who understood what the issues were and what the questions were. But once the award was done, I think what we've turned to is, while we have a contract, Martha, we have and I think Jeff said it, we have a public-private partnership. And so I think it's a real good example of how, while the FirstNet Authority has an obligation and responsibility to enforce the contract and make sure that they deliver what they committed to, I think that partnership is critically important to engage with public safety to continue to understand their needs and then translate that into whether it's applications or new technologies like mega range or location-based services, and actually deliver that. So that engagement, so it's not just a matter of coming and dealing with the contract. It's engaging with them on an ongoing basis to understand where they're going, where the public safety market is going, and that is really critical. And I can't emphasize enough how important that is. It's a foreign concept, honestly, to a lot of people. In fact, we had other people join the authority from a board perspective, and they said, why are we even bothering with that? Because we have a contract. And I said, yeah, we have a contract, but you aren't going to get the innovation and the creativity and that engagement if you don't have a partnership. So obviously there's boundaries and swim lanes that you have to stay in. You have to be careful about certain things. But I think, and Jeff and Ed can attest to it, I think without that sort of, again, Ed, the culture of having that approach and embracing that approach, I don't think we would be where we are today. And I think it's really critically important about that. So that's just my view. I was a big proponent of it. These guys know I would preach it, and probably more than they wanted to listen to it. And, but I think, because I think it's such a foreign concept in the federal government. I mean, it's very unusual. But I think the authority can be a model for other big projects like this.
Yeah, and I want to, and those are all excellent points. So I'm really glad that you brought those up. I want to step back to a different time period, though, because I think one of the things that our attendees might be grappling with is flipping that switch, converting that mindset, right? So here we have you, who is this industry specialist, clearly being a strong voice and proponent of the project. You sat at a table in Boulder, Colorado, with a representation, from what I understand, of a broad public, a broad public company sector representation. And how you depicted that was, it was all like, no, you're not going to get this, you're not going to get this, you're not going to get that. So here we have a very large corporation who eventually said yes. So how do you feel you got to yes with one critical potential partner, an inevitable partner?
Yeah, I think part of it is the way we approach the RFP. One, we didn't put a bunch of requirements down that they would feel like it would be very difficult to meet and didn't have the flexibility. It's about relationships, Martha. I mean, comes down to that. You have relationships in public safety. You have relationships and experiences in the private sector. Fortunately or not, I mean, I'm probably admitting something like I couldn't hold a job, but I worked at several of the campuses. But as a result of that, people know you, they trust you, and they have the ability to ask you questions. And so being personally engaged is really important in those conversations. And these guys know that I was very personally engaged in this whole effort. And so I think that had a lot to do with getting to yes. I also think it's important to understand that they have to get to yes on their own. They had to decide whether or not this made sense for them. And fortunately, AT&T realized that this is not something that was just an add-on. This was something that they were significantly committed to and recognized that they needed to build an organization around it. This is not a marketing plan. This is not a price plan. This is a commitment to public safety. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that whoever your partner is needs to be all into this. And I think it's important for people to understand AT&T was all in all the way to the CEO. And they are to this day. And so they have an organization dedicated to this. You can't get the kind of innovation that we're talking about without that commitment. You cannot get the responsiveness to public safety without that kind of commitment. So they had to make a decision, but we were very transparent, to Jeff's point, about the information we shared and how we engage with them so they could come to that conclusion. Other people made other decisions for economic reasons or beliefs about what actually I think other people thought it would never happen, Martha. I mean, actually people said, why should we even put any effort and energy into this, because it's never going to happen. Well, I'm sorry, but we had a different point of view. We knew it was going to happen. It was just a matter of how. So I think let me point back to my comment about the setup of the board. I think the people who designed the structure of the board, while it was very prescriptive, I think it was very insightful. If the board is very lopsided and represented by a certain group, but not the mix, then I don't think you would have the success. So I think having that mix of industry, public safety, local and state, and of course, you know, we had representatives from the federal government as well. That's what made it work. But I think that was, I don't know that all organizations are structured like that and getting that insight. So I think it's kind of like having the right people on your executive team. You know, it's having, you know, a diverse executive team with different experiences, because you bring all those ideas to the forefront. If you have too many of one mindset, you're never going to get to the right conclusion. So it was a combination of all of that I think allowed that to happen. But it was, I mean, we can talk about it now. We remember the really sleepless nights and the really hard times. It was really hard. I mean, yeah. I'll admit it. I mean, I don't know if Ed and Jeff feel that way, but every day we were struggling with how do we do this, because there was no roadmap, Martha. And to that point, we developed a strategic roadmap for the project, you know, to lay out our milestones along the way, because not only for ourselves to make sure we stayed on track, but to manage expectations externally. When you have something that's well defined, then people are comfortable. We had to define that, and to the organization's credit, we met every one of those milestones, but it was not easy to do.
Well, and
Martha, I'd like to add to that.
Sure.
Sue does not like to be complimented a lot, but I have to give Sue and Jeff Johnson a lot of credit. I was in the room for the meeting with the CEO of AT&T, Randall Stevenson, prior to us releasing the RFP, explaining what's happening. And you could see his impressive response to Sue and Jeff Johnson and the commitment and passion they were bringing and what this meant. And keep in mind, a year earlier, they had stood up in that same meeting I alluded to and said, we're never going to get priority preemption. The other key challenge is, honestly, they have 150 million commercial users, right? Public safety is a small market in those waters with you look at the operators. So it's a true testament. It is from the top down within AT&T. They took it seriously and they brought their best game to the response and the negotiations and ultimately why they were chosen.
Yeah, that's great insight. And again, I didn't realize the time frame it took to really bring at least one of those private partners on board. So thank you for that, Jeff. So we've gone over, but you guys are so full of information, and I think capturing it is so important. Archiving these perspectives for anybody that wants to try to duplicate or at least ramp something up within the constructs of their own countries. This information is going to be invaluable, and we hope to have specific webinars broken out on all of our topics that we're approaching in this particular large overarching webinar on the global PSBTA's global effort. So I'm going to give you each an opportunity. My last question to each of you is, what is the best advice that you could give to either public safety, private sector, or government leadership in other countries when it comes to tackling a like effort? And Ed, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Well, to start with the final group there, government, you've got to have public safety drive this effort. If you don't have public safety buy-in and support, I mean, it's a fool's errand. And so that's front and center. That's the philosophy we have at FirstNet. Everything we do, from our strategic investments that we make, we get public safety's input to give us the strategic direction on where to go. I think as other nations are looking to deploy similar networks, legislation certainly goes a long way to actually have a tangible support from one's congressional, legislative, executive branch leaders, however it works in their respective nations. That legislation does go a long way. As Jeff alluded to, commercial marketplace needs to understand how they're going to make money from this. They're not going to do anything that costs billions of dollars out of the good of their own heart. So there has to be that financial incentive. And I think that's another piece, the recapitalization model that Sue alluded to earlier on the conversation. You combine the will of public safety, the drive that they had, along with the legislative backbone that Congress gave us, plus then the financial model that we were able to put forward in the marketplace. Combination of those three led us to where we are today.
Yeah, fabulous. Sue, did you want to add something to that?
You know, I agree with Ed. I mean, public safety, you know, has to be involved in a significant way. We have the Public Safety Advisory Committee, you know, that reports to the board, representing over 40 organizations. So it's constant engagement. You don't have to work very hard to get out to public safety. I mean, so that's part of I think the structure that works. So have to be involved all along the way. And as Ed said, the authority does not exist for anything other than to support and advocate for public safety. They're not there just to, focus internally on themselves. Their job and responsibility is public safety. But I also think that you need, depending on the structure you have, whatever the oversight, board governance is going to be, you've got to have people who are going to be committed 150%. Because I think the worst thing you could do is get somebody who's involved in, and I see it in all kinds of situations. You have very committed people, and then you have the hanger-oners. You've got to have people who are really dedicated to this, because it does require a lot of commitment, a lot of effort, and a lot of personal engagement. So I think it's really important that you have the right people on the bus, so to speak, in all parts of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I loved your point about, what the FirstNet Authority's primary function is, right? I mean, so many other government entities are inward facing. I mean, this is a very outward facing, leaning way into public safety organization. So that's a really great distinction that you made. Thank you. Jeff, would you like to add anything to the final question?
Sure thing. I think it goes back to that partnership model, understanding where both can benefit from the partnership and extracting. And this is where I learned a tremendous amount in a short period of time, interacting with Sue and the board members, Ed Horowitz, Tim Bryan, and others, extracting as much value as you can out of the assets you're given. We knew what we had. We had 20 megahertz of spectrum. We knew pretty much what we felt it was worth. And then we had the $7 billion, and extracting the most value out of that it makes it attractive to your partner, or how you're going to deploy this, and keeping in mind, how do you keep it going? That's where a lot of projects fail, is the longer term business model, self-sustainability. That's where things run into the biggest challenges. So fortunately, I credit the drafters of the legislation in being very forward thinking on how they would bring the best of the industry, the best of public safety together to help shepherd this through that process. And that's critical. And again, it's back to public safety involvement as well as industry involvement. Somebody's got to build it. Somebody's got to implement it. You want them driven to the same needs of public safety, back to that comment.
Yeah, and if you want to see it in your lifetime, it's best to engage that private partner, right, Sue? And to both of your points, Jeff and Ed, you both brought up the financial piece, and Ed, I thought your point was very well placed with, you have to show where this is going to add value to that private partner, right? It's a great cause, but these are large corporations that have boards to answer to and shareholders to answer to. So it's really, really important to also have that be in the forefront of mapping and framing this entire effort. Incredible insights from all of you, and I really do appreciate the discussion. We went over, but again, these will all be available individually online. So if people don't want to sit through the entire webinar when we go live, we completely understand, but we're going to make sure all of this information stays available. And this is a perfect setup for our final session, the role of the private partner. Our next interview will be with Jim Bugel, the Vice President over FirstNet built with AT&T. This interview, as I said, did go over a little bit as well, my interview with Jim. So, but the information and the perspective is so valuable that we wanted to share every minute of all of these discussions with our attendees. As a reminder, they're all recorded and will be made available on the PSBTA webpage, which is thepsbta.org. Stand by for session 4, and thank you again, panelists.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you, everybody.
We've now heard from our public safety representatives who are instrumental in securing the D block spectrum, in addition to those responsible for helping bring the FirstNet Authority to life. The final critical piece in successfully laying the foundation for FirstNet was securing a willing and reliable private partner. Let's shift our focus to the role of that private partner in an undertaking like FirstNet. I'd like to introduce Jim Bugel, the Vice President over FirstNet for AT&T, who is joining us today for our final session before the roundtable. Jim, thank you for being here.
Martha, thank you for inviting me.
Can we just take a minute or two to get a little bit of background on you first?
Yes, I've been in the wireless industry, the commercial wireless industry, for well over 35 years. I have been with the predecessor companies and now AT&T for over 30 years. And I've been working directly with public safety for well over 20 years in serving their needs.
Fantastic. So when were you first introduced to the idea that public safety has unique broadband needs and a separate network should be recognized and developed accordingly?
It became evident as the adoption of commercial wireless services happened throughout the country. Basically, public safety was adopting them just as the general public was. But we've all had that experience where there's been a high concentration of commercial customers on the commercial network, and you receive blocking. Basically, you're unable to get through. The idea of having a special class of service for public safety has really been around since 9/11 and the need for it.
So was there a natural progression then in your efforts and contributions to securing the D block?
Yes. So as the 9/11 Commission reported, the lack of interoperability and the lack of network access in a highly concentrated event was one of the challenges that the first responders had, and one of the reasons for the loss of life. So from that point on, from an AT&T perspective, then Singular, we looked at what can we do to provide an elevated class of service for our first responders. The federal government, meaning the FCC, established what we call WPS, or Wireless Priority Service, but it was a circuit switched technology that really didn't apply to a mission critical environment.
Yeah, and I'm well familiar with that, having been a first responder, and it's a great tool. I don't want to diminish it in any way, shape, or form, but it is a little bit cumbersome, right? Where you've got to plug in your codes, and it is strictly voice. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to capture a broader capability with what we're putting together with FirstNet as we go through this story from your perspective. So, what are some of the private sector insights that you thought were most helpful to public safety in securing the D block?
So, basically, as you look at the adoption of wireless services by public safety is has a narrow band environment, LMR, but the transition was moving along. They were adopting wireless technology for convenience, and quite frankly, in a lot of cases, because it was an economic alternative. Then we move into the smartphone era, 2006, 2007, and now we have a tremendous amount of capability for our first responders. But they are basically treated as commercial customers on the network. You have consumers, you have enterprise customers, you have government customers, but everybody had the same class of service. And public safety, it was recognized by AT&T that public safety had to have priority on the network. And so it worked with public safety in the D block effort to try to get the spectrum and the money to build a dedicated network. To your point about WPS, FirstNet is always on with priority. It's text, voice, data, video. It's reliable and constantly on.
And I think that reliability piece, Jim, I think back to the days of walking through the exhibit halls, right, at some of our bigger conferences. Clearly, everybody was trying to, I like to joke, I like to say they're trying to compete with their 12-year-olds, right? They're trying to get that same kind of connectivity and access and capabilities on their phones that their kids have, right? The kids are doing all these incredible things. But the linchpin is clearly the actual network, right? So you can build all these incredible tools, but if your network isn't reliable or you don't have a means to restore that network in a very short time period, it renders all of those things useless. So go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's the network. You can package it any way you want to package it, but it needs to be reliable, stable. The first responder has to have confidence in it. They have to be able to say, I will put mission critical services on this. And quite frankly, I'll put lives and healthy and safe and healthy of our first responders on it. And that is something that they need to depend on, the network. Exactly right.
Well, and I really relate this to a pretty tectonic paradigm shift, really, because you know as well as anybody, it's hard to pry those LMR radios out of people's hands. Even when they're pushing the button and nothing's happening, they still, that's their, that's what they're used to. So it's really interesting to watch the whole industry shift so much to the point where the paradigm shift of just accepting using that broadband network is going to become clearly more of a norm than an anomaly, right?
Right. And what we're also seeing is the shift in the population. Remember, the first responders that are coming into the industry right now are digital natives. They grew up with the smartphone, and they're used to having the access of the internet at their fingertips and instantaneous. Basically, it will continue to evolve that way. To your point, there became a point in time around, I don't know, 2004, 2003, where those are in public safety were saying, why does the teenager walking down the street have more communications capability than my officer or firefighters? And that became a big issue, and it really drove public safety to say, we need to have a place, a secure place with spectrum and a network in the broadband and wireless broadband environment.
Yeah, and we really had a great conversation with that panel, two interviews earlier. So they really brought some great perspective to that importance and really elevating that that broadband network into the overall communications plans. So let's go back and talk a little bit about what it took to really build this private partnership. Can you talk about some of the decision points that you and your company went through before deciding to actually bid?
Sure. When it became evident that Congress was going to take the action to establish FirstNet and establish a nationwide wireless broadband carrier for public safety with, as the law says, a dedicated network, dedicated core, priority and preemption. When it became evident that that was happening, we viewed ourselves as one of several companies in America that could build that network. More importantly, we also knew that Congress didn't provide the FirstNet Authority with the money that is required to build a nationwide network. Hence the public-private partnership, right? Mm-hmm. The law brought 20 megahertz of spectrum, $7.5 billion. AT&T brings our entire network, our footprint, our towers, our backhaul. And so that's the nature of the public-private partnership. That's the kind of underlying mechanics of it. The overarching issue is that from a company perspective, we viewed it as a national imperative. If we don't do this, who is going to do this? We have the capabilities to do this. We have the skills to do this. We're very familiar with long-term government contracts. And we also know that something like this, quite frankly, is just too big to fail. And that's how we approached it.
Well, and I love your point about who else is going to do this if it's not us, because if I'm not mistaken, you guys were the only large private carrier, right, that even put a bid in. Is that correct?
That is correct. But I can't explain others' behaviors.
Right. Boy, that you got that right. But we're clearly very appreciative that you did. So let's talk a little bit, because this is a big deal, right? You're a huge corporation, and I want to talk a little bit as a publicly held corporation. What are the incentives to participate in this? I mean, clearly you saw the whole idea that we had to do this because nobody else was going to do this, but you're a corporation. So let's talk a little bit about the actual incentives to participate.
It's interesting because speaking my background, being a mobility background, as we transition from amps to 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, 6G, 7G, and beyond, we provide the network. The customers decide how to use the network. They do things on the network that we, quite frankly, don't even imagine, because they're the practitioners, the retail industry, the healthcare industry, the financial industry, transportation. They find you give them a strong, reliable network, and they will put things on it that just amaze you. Public safety is no different. As we built the network, public safety started to adopt it and started to utilize it in many ways we expected, in a lot of ways we didn't expect. But what it does is it drives us to be a better company. It drives us to build in increased reliability, to drive in higher dependence. And so it's basically, it makes the entire company better. That's how we feel.
All ships are rising with the tide, correct? And it's such a great point, right? I mean, that creativity and the innovation that is taken off right now, it clearly has changed everything about the wireless industry across the board. I mean, even as you look, literally across other carriers, but clearly the FirstNet network stands alone, head and shoulders above, because of so many of the elements that are built into it. And I think just briefly what I'll talk about before we get into the RFP process is making sure that everybody understands that, there's statutory language that drives what you do. There is a very robust contract with benchmarks that drives what you do. So I really liked that point that, you're leveraging this opportunity to really make every aspect of AT&T a better company. So I really, really like that point. So let's talk a little bit about getting ready for that RFP. Can you take us through the process of what, I know it's probably, briefly, through the whole process of preparing that AT&T RFP response?
Well, that's kind of a period of my life I tried to forget. I mean, I think the response was something like 900 pages. It's a 25-year contract that I have to really compliment the FirstNet Authority and the leadership of the FirstNet Authority, because the law gave the overall framework of what the network should look like. But they took a unique approach, and they made an objectives-based contract. And basically they set the metrics of performance across the network. And this allowed us to be very aggressive in the way we were approaching this, because if you had a lot of specified elements in the contract, well, you have to maintain, as the technology evolves, you have to maintain those legacy elements, which then you kind of lose the scale. And remember, a big issue here is to be able to scale the FirstNet across the AT&T network, so that you have a device ecosystem, you have an applications ecosystem, and you have customer pricing that is scaled, that is competitive in the marketplace. And we'll get into that in a second. But more importantly, we looked at this not as an opportunity, but as, from a company perspective, as an obligation. We didn't know if we would win, but we knew we had to put our best foot forward. This was an obligation from AT&T to the first responders of our country who keep our citizens safe. We had to put our best foot forward. And so it's more of an obligation rather than an opportunity. That's the way we looked at it.
Well, that's fantastic. As a first responder, that is an incredible perspective to hear from such a large corporation. So again, I will speak on behalf of the first responders. Thank you for having that perspective. So you talked about the performance base and the latitude that was written into the RFP. Can you talk a little bit about the willingness to really engage under a contract to the rigid oversight and requirements of FirstNet? And before you answer, I will say that many recoiled from that. And why did AT&T lean into that?
Well, again, you have to lean into it because it's too big to fail. I mean, quite frankly, you have a once in a lifetime opportunity to provide a wireless broadband network for the security of this country, its first responders, and its citizens. It can't fail. It just literally can't fail. The contract is 25 years, but we're really talking about public safety broadband services for the next 125 years. Where else is there going to be clean spectrum to do this, right? So if you look at that, we want to make sure that we created something that the first responders would use. Again, credit to the FirstNet Authority and putting those specifics into the contract, and they were pretty spot on. And if you look at the success of FirstNet, I won't go through the numbers, but if you look at the success of FirstNet and how quickly the first responder community has adopted it, what it shows is that there was clearly a void, a very big void in the marketplace for a priority service, reasonably priced, dedicated core that first responders could put mission critical services on. That void was clearly in the marketplace. It was trying to be filled by commercial services, but we needed that differentiated offer with priority and preemption and dedicated core and security to make sure that we really hit the mark with the first responders.
Yeah, and you can only get so far as a first responder, kind of bending to the will of that corporate interest, right? I mean, because clearly towers are going where they're going to make money, and so the first responder really had to work within that framework. But this completely changes it, and I really liked your point about when I brought up those rigid oversights, the benchmarks and so forth. I mean, really, I think what you just said is that those are beneficial to AT&T. Those help you formulate that roadmap and know where those intermittent goals and objectives really are waiting for you years or months ahead, correct?
Right, exactly. And I think a really important point that you brought up is that because of a publicly traded company, you have to be very judicious with your investments. And FirstNet was able to use the money that Congress gave them to basically build cell sites that would not have been built by a wireless carrier. Now, this has a domino effect to it, because what happens is when you build wireless, when you build wireless broadband services, specifically band 14 in areas that are unserved, then the first responders move out further, right? It also adds to the stability of the network, which is really important. Now, carrying on from there, you have a bunch of opportunity, and the opportunity is for those that really want to get on the edge. You have things like HPUE and other things that are expanding the network. So it's one of the things that we take a lot of pride in, that we're now serving first responders with wireless broadband services where they've never been served before.
Yeah, and you brought up the HPUE, which is also a great point, right? It isn't just about that initial foundation of the framework of FirstNet. Things just keep evolving and getting better and better and better. And the high power user equipment is clearly a great example of that. And that is exclusive to FirstNet. Nobody's going to be able to utilize that type of equipment on any other commercial network. So again, it's that unprecedented access that you guys are providing. And I had a great experience in Nebraska when I was at a first responders event and representing FirstNet, or excuse me, a public safety event. I was representing FirstNet. It really became crystal clear to me that these folks who are riding in the back of ambulances, that don't have a 10-minute response, delivery time to a hospital like I'm used to in a metropolitan area. They're on in the back of that ambulance sometimes for a couple of hours.
Yep.
And to be able to be connected to that medical control that entire time just elevates the level of service exponentially. Have a MD with you the whole time in the back of that ambulance per se, as opposed to maybe just your EMT or paramedic level of service. So again, there's just all of these incredible cascading benefits to what's going on here. So again, I really love the points that you're making.
And we're
So
really
okay.
proud of stuff. Yeah, I mean, the stuff that we're doing on tribal lands and other rural communities that are unserved, we're really proud of that work. That is, and to your point, transports can be as long as 4.5 hours or longer.
Right. Yeah, and I'll tell you what, I think that they are definitely appreciating it because all of those rural communities have been fairly underserved when it comes to a reliable, robust network like what they're getting now. So again, more cascading benefit to what's going on. So after you all had signed the contract and everything was in place, can you talk about the initial strategy in constructing the AT&T FirstNet workforce? Because that had to be a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it was. I mean, so you take an RFP, which is a stack of 900 pages of paper, and now you have to build a team around it. The good news for us is that we had actually established our FirstNet team years before that. We had started our first, I believe the first time we put our FirstNet team together was formally was probably 2010 or 2011. So we started working on it, and then when the legislation was signed, we were able to really just kind of move on quickly, and the team grew as we moved on. However, like all big organizations, we had a lot of people that wanted to participate. Look at FirstNet as AT&T's moonshot. This was the moonshot, right? this was get a LTE network on a dedicated band operating across the country as soon as possible. Really amazing, right? Really amazing. Get 2 million customers on it and before FOC. Really amazing stuff. So the people that wanted to be on this team internally, and oh, by the way, we took a lot of first responders and put them on the team. As you well know, we actively worked with a lot of people that are in the industry, and we asked them to come in and help us design and implement these programs. And quite frankly, that's a big success. And then not very important issue is the relationship that we have as our strategic alliance with the fire, EMS, law enforcement leadership, of understanding the challenges that they're faced with and building products and services that directly impact them. Simple things like rate plans and how to get devices. That stuff, they have been just incredibly insightful and really helped to the network satisfaction level.
Well, and I love that you've brought a lot of first responders into your workforce, right? Because I think that's one of the things that first responders kind of flinch about, oh, it's either a federal takeover or a corporate takeover, but you guys are working so hard to continually insert that first responder perspective, right? Well, no, I've heard it out in the field, Jim, that. So
it's interesting because you'd say federal takeover or corporate takeover. Inside of AT&T, we say it was a public safety takeover.
There you go. And that is such a great point. Oh my gosh, I love that, because that is spot on. That is much more reflective of what's going on here, right? So once you get this team up and rolling, and again, I want to reiterate, I think it's great that you had such a robust team clearly engaged in that whole RFP process and laying that foundation. And thankfully you got the contract and were able to move them directly into that underpinning of what became your FirstNet team. But again, I think what's really cool about that as well is not only did you have a team of people who were ready to hit the ground running, but you immediately turned over, you gave public safety access to the entire AT&T network right out of the chute, so that FirstNet didn't have to wait for the core to be built and other elements to be built out, like hanging the radios and so forth. Can you talk just really quickly about that strategy and why that idea came about?
Well, so basically, when we looked at the RFP, as it said, it was Band 14 nationwide network, and our leadership at the time basically said, look, getting back to the imperative, right? We don't really have 5 years to build out this network. We need to get first responders priority and preemption as quickly as possible. The need is now. The level at which first responders are adopting wireless broadband services, we're only going to have additional challenges if we don't move now. I mean, we've learned our experience through event after event. So I actually have to credit the guy in our company named Scott Mayer, who came up with the idea of, let's make some arrangements and let's basically give them priority and preemption across all of our commercial bands, which was not something that FirstNet Authority asked for, but something that we felt we could offer while we built out Band 14. Now, with important aspect, public safety gets end-to-end priority across not only our commercial network, but more importantly, across dedicated Band 14. And so that's the way that we knew we could actually deliver what public safety needed from day one. And obviously the results show that that was the right move.
Yeah, truly. So clearly, when you start things off, there's bound to be changes that need to be made, adjustments, evolutions of ideas per se. So what types of adjustments, if any, have been made in the strategy that you've been rolling out as FirstNet's evolved over the last several years?
So I think probably the biggest one is the need for deployable assets in the contract. In the RFP, FirstNet put that their market sensing was that public safety needed the need for expanded coverage, coverage to be restored in an area where it had been knocked down for whatever reason. And so the idea of satellite cows sell on wheels and satellite colts sells on light trucks have been around for years, but they were used in different methodologies across all the carriers. All the commercial carriers used them differently. But FirstNet said the FirstNet customers need to have access to those. So they looked at it as kind of a lending library where you'd have a certain amount on the shelf and then people would come use them when they needed to come. We took that and refined that significantly. We realized that basically public safety needed to be able to depend on having coverage in an unserved area during a search and rescue mission, or during some event, some tactical operation, or that coverage needed to be restored in a wide area of a large, huge outage like a hurricane or something like that. So we've taken that, created the FirstNet Response Operations Group. The number of assets we keep adding to, FirstNet's even added several in the last couple of years, and that is a core discipline we have of being able to offer a service to our FirstNet customers that they call, we will bring in that coverage when needed. And that's kind of gone from, like I said, this lending library to an always-on service that's highly reliable and, quite frankly, one of the defining elements of the FirstNet program.
Yeah, and I tell you, making that shift from basically I'm going to check out this sat colt or whatever it might be, to being able to engage with the team, the ROG as they're referred to, Response Operations Group, it is such a game changer. And it goes back to what I said about that fear of takeover, because even during a large operation, when you have these sat colts or communications on wheels, or even the aerostat that's going up in the air, you always are a little reluctant as that incident commander. How much are they going to be taking over, per se, my event and my communications? But one of the things that makes the ROG so interesting and different is the fact that they do a lot of blue sky work, right? When your community is not on its end, they're in there talking to you about strategizing where staging is going to be optimized, and what do you anticipate maybe in some of those more predictable emergencies within some of these communities. So it's so much deeper than just checking out an asset. And your team that you've put together, of course, are the highest level of former first responders that are advising and deploying with these assets. So again, I applaud AT&T for that willingness to look at the need, get the feedback, and really let this evolve to truly be a useful and reliable, like you said, component of FirstNet. So I think it's fantastic. So I want to go in. Yeah,
FirstNet One. FirstNet One. I mean, I thank you for mentioning it. I mean, it's the only dedicated public safety aerostat in the world, right?
It really is remarkable.
And you bring up a really good point. The Response Operations Group, it's all public safety. I mean, these are all public safety professionals, and that blue sky work is done, all throughout the entire year. And so there is just that comfort level of familiarity, and we're going to do the right thing, and trust. I mean, it's just basically it's trust and confidence that we have with the customers.
Well, and again, you bring up a great point as well. Clearly, there has to be a difference in how you interact with that public safety community client as opposed to commercial. Their needs are different, their expectations are different. So can you talk a little bit just about that shift and maybe the strategy and dealing with that public safety audience? And you kind of touched on it, but maybe more specific.
Don't fail.
Don't fail. But what's the strategy behind that? I mean, clearly you've got a lot going on here. So what do you feel is the difference between that first responder expectation of you versus your consumer, your general customers?
That's probably a good context. In the commercial world, it's by definition called best effort. FirstNet world, best effort doesn't cut it. It's zero failure. That's it. I hate to get this graphic, but it's an annoyance when your wireless broadband service stops and you can't do something on Amazon. It's life and death when you have a first responder on the other line.
Absolutely.
And that is the culture, the mentality, the tenacity that has become part of the FirstNet program, both in AT&T and in the FirstNet Authority. And that's what the first responders have taught us. That's what public safety has taught us. If you're going to be out there asking us to depend on you, it's not a financial commitment as much. Financial commitments we can talk about all day long. We're talking about the tactical, operational, mission critical commitment. Will you be with us? First of all, things go wrong. That's why we're in this business. Things go wrong. It's how you perform when things go wrong. Do you say, no, I guess, well, that broke, we'll see you later. That's not what you do in this business. No, that broke, we have another one coming in, or we already have a spare here. That is when you have that mutual respect and dependability on each other.
Well, and I'll tell you what, Jim, I've been to enough post-incident analysis meetings where the very first thing that always comes up as an epic fail is communications. And so I just look at the possibilities of being able to overcome that and what that means, what that cascading impact is on situational awareness and the ability to mitigate and recover. I mean, all of those elements are so tightly tethered to the ability to communicate and get that subject matter expertise from all over the country, maybe even all over the world, and share what's going on that scene to anybody that you need to tap into without even having them standing right next to you. So the cascading impact is what really astounds me every time I look at the next bump in the evolution of FirstNet. I'm like, wow,
that's that great partnership that you're talking about, is that we're providing this network. It has so much opportunity in it, and we dovetail in with what public safety needs, and our teams work together. And we're surprised at what they want, and they're surprised at what we have, and it's okay. This is good.
Yeah, those are good surprises. At the highest possible level, Jim, we're going to finish with this question. What advice would you give to public safety advocates in other countries trying to replicate FirstNet in their country, given the diversity of frameworks, right? I mean, we have what we have in this country, but clearly across the world, there's a lot of people who would like to accomplish this, but maybe they're dealing with something different than what we have here. What's your advice for trying to get people at least get their first foot forward?
Yeah, so I mean, it's unfortunately, you have to resist from a government perspective. You have to resist what you're trained to do, and what you're trained to do is basically create a highly proscribed, structured, A, B, C, D, E, F, G in order to get to the end result. You have a lot of capable commercial potential partners out there, but the technology is changing so rapidly, the economics change so rapidly, and you basically need to put out very high structured objectives and say, if you get there, you get paid. Don't tell them how to get there. Tell them what you want and what the first responders need. And they've got the know-how, they have the skill to get it done. That's number one. Number two, make sure they are absolutely serving the needs of the first responders, so that if they don't serve the needs of their first responders, they have somewhere else to go so they can get their needs met. And getting back to FirstNet, it's our obligation to be the very best for public safety, or they'll go somewhere else. So we have to continue to innovate. We have to continue to scale. We have to continue to expand in order to do that.
Well, and I do really love the objectives and performance-based kind of roadmap, because we don't know what you know, right? First responders don't know what those professionals in the communications world know, and a lot of times you don't. I just love that symbiotic relationship, right? I mean, the synergy of what's going on here with FirstNet is really what's so remarkable. And again, Chris Moore summed it up when he said, just getting this in place was like catching lightning in a bottle. But I think that lightning just keeps ricocheting off the insides of that bottle, because it just more and more and more happens, and it really is remarkable.
It does, and for those around the world that want to do this, you cannot ignore the economics. You have to scale across existing platforms. You cannot do a greenfield. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to ignore the old. We're going to ignore the economics of the broader industry. You have to springboard off those economics, and that's what the FirstNet Authority, quite frankly, did so beautifully. Was they basically built a program that allowed the full force of the economics, to the degree that the vendor wanted to bring it to the table. And guess what? You got things like priority preemption across all the bands. That's the thing that can happen.
Yeah, I just love all those points. And again, nothing gets done in a silo. I think that's one of the key points I believe that you're making here. Clearly, nothing will get done effectively in a silo. There has to be that interconnectivity.
Right.
All right, Jim. Well, thank you again for providing this extraordinary insight from the private partner perspective. It's clear that public safety community is very fortunate to have you as a champion for FirstNet. To our attendees, I hope that you all found our interviews helpful and will stay with us for our live roundtable panel discussion coming right up. Again, thank you, Jim Bugal, for your time.
Thank you, Martha. Appreciate it.
Welcome to the live portion of our FirstNet Global webinar. Please welcome back Al Gillespie, Richard Murgon, Chuck Dowd, Chris Moore, Jeff Johnson, Kevin McGinnis, Sue Swenson, Ed Parkinson, Jeff Bratcher, Jim Bugal, and our Deputy Executive Director, Carl Wilmes. Quite a large panel, but we're going to do the best we can at navigating some of these questions and making sure that everybody gets a chance to chime in. So thank you, panelists, for joining us. Honestly, seeing all of your faces up here is quite unprecedented, considering what we went through to get everybody organized and scheduled. So thank you very much for making time for this. I will be asking attendee questions in addition to some follow-up questions based on our panelist discussions. Also, I will be directing questions to each of you individually. However, I highly encourage any of you to chime in with your insights on any of the questions if you'd like. So let's jump into some of these questions. And Ed, I'm going to start with you because I understand you are on some time constraints. Clearly, one of the common threads of what we were talking about throughout these past 4 panel discussions was about the objectives-based bidding process. And the question being posed is, did it take longer to develop that objectives-based bidding process compared to a traditional requirement?
Thanks, Martha. And it's good to see everyone today. You can hear me okay, right? Yep.
Loud and clear.
Not so much longer. I think what's important is, as Sue and Jeff talked about earlier on in the panel, it all is about the preparation that goes into a successful project. And we knew, based off the feedback from public safety, that we couldn't go about doing this the same way that government procurement was done before. And so going out, having those industry days that Jeff talked about, engaging through RFIs, I think we had about 13 or 14 of those, really engaging with the marketplace and understanding what the market could provide versus what public safety needed. Blending those two together really illustrated the fact that there was one way to do this properly, and that was through the statement of objectives. So while on the one hand, I think public safety and the marketplace were a little frustrated in terms of how long we took of our preparation, absolutely it was the right thing to do, and it made sure that we were ultimately successful. The statement of work opportunity versus the statement of objectives, I think would have missed some of what public safety needed. And so going out through a statement of objectives really allowed for the marketplace to bring forward the capabilities that they could provide, as opposed to us being prescriptive on the 10,000 or probably million or so requirements that were needed in such a deal. So I'll also pass that over to Jeff. I mean, Jeff was really intimately involved in a lot of the work there, Jeff Bratcher. So Jeff, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that one.
Yes, can you hear me okay, Martha and Ed?
You bet.
Yeah, and I thought Jim Bugal nailed it as well. We wanted to let the industry innovate and bring the solution. We weren't going to be very prescriptive. We knew overall the needs that public safety had. They needed access to the network in the times of dire crisis and when they were saving lives, and how could they best rely on that network and get that access. So going with objectives on, here's everything on the table we need to make this a successful network for the next 25 to 50 years, and let industry then decide, all right, what's the best way to meet those needs through the objectives approach. And it was very, very there'll be studies, I'm certain, in different master's programs on public administration on how this public-private partnership was put together on that aspect.
Well, and I think one of the really important parts, as people are leaning into this idea and are at various stages of trying to implement this within their own countries, is first of all, there's a lot of stakeholder considerations, right? You have to have everybody's input and interests at hand. But most importantly, what I'm hearing you say is you got to be patient. And I can, we're where we are in the United States, and I'm sure a lot of folks would just love to, wave a magic wand and have this network stood up in their country. But you really have to be patient. And what I'm hearing from you guys with this objectives-based bidding process is it is really about getting into the specifics and making sure that the objectives are always in the forefront instead of being prescriptive, as you're saying. So great points. Hey, Ed,
And
I was
Martha,
going to ask.
can I add in real quick?
Please.
From our side, from Chris, JJ, and I having this concept, what people like Ed and Jeff did was nothing less than brilliant. I mean, they broke the model. They did things nobody else had done. And I remember as they're going through this process, getting calls from those people worked with going, they're doing what? I mean, this whole shock factor, but look at the end result here of how successful it has been to where the world is looking at it. And was through their innovation and leadership that got us there. So, a lot of credit goes to those two and the people that work with them to do that, to break that model, break the bottle, and do something different.
Well, and I love your point about the innovation in the process itself, right? You lay that groundwork, and the very framework is full of that opportunity to innovate. It just cascades and influences everything that goes forward. So great point, Dick. I appreciate that. Ed, I'm going to ask you how many. Let's give the audience an idea. How many years have we actually been working on FirstNet from flipping that switch to where we are today?
I mean, you've got to go before turning on the switch, don't you? I remember, I think, Chris, you were there, wasn't it? It was the ICP conference in San Diego, first conversations, I guess we can call them that today, around this. And it's interesting hearing the conversations today again. It really comes down to, I mean, so that was 2008, right? So here we now, 13 years, it'll be 10 years since the legislation was passed next February. Contract was signed in 17. First board meeting, Sue and JJ, I mean, that was 2013, I believe, August 2012, maybe something like that. So bottom line, it's been a labor of love, I suppose we could call it one way or another. But I think it comes down to the fact that how bad does public safety want this? And public safety was relentless. And that's so important. I made that comment earlier on. This cannot be done without the input and the drive coming from public safety. So for everyone listening in one's respective countries, I feel very fortunate that we've developed relationships with public safety representatives, government representatives from all around the world. And that just shows the power of the community. But without public safety driving this, it's simply not going to happen. And you've got to have that catalyst coming from the community and this sort of will not take no for an answer attitude that really helps get this to where it was. And if you don't have that commitment, if you don't have that leadership from public safety, it's just simply not going to be possible to get this done. So I would really, in terms of timing, without that leadership coming from public safety and that consistency and the commitment that those leaders showed, we wouldn't be here today.
And great point. And so we go from having absolutely nothing, right? Public safety's essentially just using what's available to them through the commercial networks. So to date, Ed, where have we come as far as how many FirstNet users do we actually have currently?
Yeah, so we're knocking on a little over 2.2 million. That's growing exceptionally fast. We've got about 16,000 agencies, a little over, on the FirstNet system today. When you look at the deployment, I think the program is a little over 90% complete. The initial deployment covering 2.71 million square miles here in the United States. So it's remarkable. It really is. In a very short period of time, the speed at which the deployment has come and the adoption. Remember, this is public safety's network. And I often get asked the question, well, why would public safety sign up? It's more than price. It's more than the terrific coverage and so on. It's the emotional attachment that this has for public safety. This is public safety's network. This is their opportunity to create something for themselves, by themselves, and that's never happened before. And I think the power of having a company like AT&T come to the equation, the oversight capabilities and the public safety voice that the authority provides, and then obviously that continual public safety input is fundamental to the success of where we are. So, I remember there was an article a few years ago saying, is FirstNet one of the biggest mistakes coming out of the 9/11 Commission? And I was thinking about that coming onto this call today. And I'd say, I can't even remember the guy who wrote that piece, but 2.5 million public safety users can't be wrong. So it's good to see that.
Well, and I'm very glad that the public safety community has risen to the occasion and recognized what all of this means to them and, you know, future generations of first responders. And I loved what Jim had said when it wasn't a corporate or a government takeover, it was a public safety takeover, which I think most clearly captures what's gone on here. So Ed, thank you very much. If you have to depart, we truly do appreciate your participation, and we will catch you hopefully on another webinar in the future. Hey, I'm going to move to Jeff Bratcher. And Jeff, we had a lot of questions about FirstNet and 5G. Can you talk a little bit about what FirstNet is doing with 5G?
Sure thing, Martha. So the legislation actually required the authority to look ahead as well and keep this network up to date with commercial wireless standards and enhancements. Key to that, if you think back, we awarded this in March of 17. It was well within the 4G LTE deployment. It was going gangbusters across the United States. At that time, we envisioned 5G would be in around the 2024-2025 timeframe. Well, industry pushed hard and moved that timeline to the left. So we adapted to that, and just last year we had our board based on public safety input and seeing that 5G, happening now within the United States. We now have an investment that is upgrading and enhancing our dedicated core network to allow the FirstNet users access to AT&T's commercial 5G network through the core. And that's an implementation through the standards. I won't bore you too much. It's this 3X option that the industry is using as they migrate to 5G. Public safety has been very vocal. They don't want to be on bleeding edge, but they want to be fast followers of these technology enhancements. And that's what we're committed in doing now with AT&T and working that as the next phase of the project for the 5G capabilities.
Well, I love that perspective of not wanting to necessarily be on the leading edge because they can't leave themselves vulnerable to some of those untested technologies, but the quick follow, that's a fantastic way of putting it. So, at the beginning, or excuse me, at the end of January, we had 4 really fantastic announcements on FirstNet, HPU Easy Access, the compact deployables. I wanted you to talk a little bit about some of the innovations that's going on within FirstNet, and what, if you had a crystal ball and you were willing to share it with us, what kind of cutting edge innovation do you see happening perhaps in the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's a great question, Martha. And we also had the fortunate part of the legislation that focused $300 million in research and development for public safety communications through the NIST Public Safety Communications Research Program. And seeing a lot of the challenges and what they've been driving, the situational awareness, I think you're going to see some tremendous advances in some of the augmented reality and the capabilities, even this last year in the pandemic. Emergency response has changed drastically for EMS as well. We're seeing a lot of push in the EMS community on different capabilities. Now that they have a network they can rely on and use, that's where they want to start moving and being able to do the remote medicine, the telemedicine, as well as the enhanced awareness of activities and incidents for police and fire and some of the emergency management. I was thinking back on a lot of the things we've already done in a short amount of time. It's only been a little over 4 years now since we really started the build and creation of this network. And one thing I have learned in my 20 years almost, public safety will tell you what they want. And our job is to figure out how to translate those into requirements, standards, and get the industry to bring those to them so that they can do their jobs in saving lives.
That's a great perspective. And again, I think the whole apparatus is really designed to lean into that ongoing evolution and keeping up with what the industry is doing as a whole. One final question, since we have you here, and I know that this is on the mind of many. Do you see that, with 5G and the growing numbers of users, do you feel like we're going to have enough spectrum based on what we currently have allocated?
So I'll say there's no wireless carrier, and I see FirstNet as a wireless carrier that will say they don't need more spectrum. And I know our public safety users are going to use it if we can get it and bring it to the network. I talked about some of the upcoming 5G capabilities, and that's really leveraging wider bandwidths of spectrum. You get bigger chunks of spectrum for those low latency, very intensive, high data throughput applications when you think video and AR, VR, a lot of these other capabilities. The simple answer is we always need more spectrum, Martha. If we can get it, we're going to put it in this network and use it and let public safety do what they need to do with it and build that into this network.
Great, and thank you very much. It's so nice to have this insider track, right, to be able to ask you these kinds of questions and have you share that perspective with our audience. All right, I'm going to move on to you, Chuck, if you don't mind. I want you to talk a little bit about how difficult it was initially to educate the public safety executives on the importance of pushing for the spectrum. Because interestingly enough, clearly we had to not only overcome the exterior pushback, but we also had internal pushback. So can you speak a little bit more specifically about the things that were deployed for that?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Martha. You can hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. So, this goes back, and it's been mentioned a couple times, to the ICP conference where I first met Chris Moore. I met him in the morning, and by the afternoon, we had, and I don't know how we did this to this day. I don't know. It still amazes me. The Major Cities Chiefs Association authored and then voted on a resolution to ask the FCC not to auction the spectrum until public safety could figure out what its actual needs were. So Chris and I sat there late that afternoon, about 4 o'clock. Everybody else was at the cocktail party, and Chris and I are scratching our heads. We got there, don't worry about it. We got to the cocktail party. But we're sitting there scratching our heads saying, okay, now we broke it. How do we fix this, right? So, so we went forward from there. But one of the struggles was, even that day, and it's amazing that we got it done, and the level of trust, quite frankly, that the major, this is the Major Cities Police Chiefs Association, that the trust that they showed in me and Chris, and quite frankly others that were there, Billy Casey from Boston, Deputy Superintendent, was that they were willing to vote on this and push this out to the FCC in the space of, what was it, Chris? I think like 3 hours or 4 hours, right?
Yeah.
And so this concept, right, was very foreign to them, because if you had that day taken a poll of how many people had a BlackBerry, or the equivalent of a smartphone at that point, right, and it was probably in the realm of maybe 25% of the chiefs from the major cities that were present in the room. So, the whole concept of needing spectrum and needing our own network was something that took a long time for them to get to wrap their heads around. And that was a big part of our mission on both sides, the law enforcement side, the fire side, and the EMS side, that to get them to understand where public safety communications were going and what we needed in order to be able to accomplish that mission.
Well, and excellent points as well. And I think this would be a really interesting time, Carl, for you to chime in. Carl Wellmus is the Deputy Executive Director of the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association. And if you take a second, Carl, introduce yourself, because you're new to the webinar. And what I'd like you to do once you introduce yourself is speak to some of the things that Chuck just brought up. I mean, you were a chief at the time, or somewhere in the higher ranks of the police department. I'm not 100% sure when you got promoted, but talk about your perspective out there in the field when you start first hearing about FirstNet, and what it took to really bring you along and convince you that this was the right thing to do and get behind.
Well, thanks, Martha, and hello, everybody. My name is Carl Wellmus, and I'm currently the Deputy Executive Director for the association. And but my past life, I led 3 police organizations, 2 as police chief. And so to Martha's question, it was pretty interesting, because when we first heard about it as a police chief and police departments, and at that time I was with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, we all thought it was kind of a big lift, to be honest with you. As probably not so unique here in the United States, across the country, public safety sometimes is a little bit skeptical. And so a lot of us said, well, let's see. But credit to the AT&T team and the FirstNet team, both did incredible work. because they actually work with law enforcement. And I've heard everybody, this morning talk about, well, we had to engage law enforcement, we had to engage law enforcement. Well, I can tell you from my perspective as a police chief then, that they actually did what they said that they were doing. And Bugel talked about it, and they created a great team. And so you talk about a team with AT&T and a big corporation and the response operations group. So when the response operations group comes in, in a lot of areas, where are they going to be? Well, with AT&T and FirstNet, they're right with the first responders. I mean, they're sleeping in the same gym as they are at a crisis. And so that goes a long way to building trust. And they continue to say and be part of rather than apart from. And really that trust, like any relationship, that's really the North Star in public safety. So we've all talked about it today, but my number one responsibility as a police chief is to keep the staff safe and the community safe, and reliability of this network. It does what it says, and the people behind it are actually that trusted and committed relationship. That's what makes it work.
Yeah, well, and I love how you said that first responders are a little bit skeptical. I think that was very generous of you, Chief, but because we all know, right? You really have to show it to a first responder to prove it. And again, to your point of not only were they being told what was going to happen, as the actual actions began to unfold, they were consistent with what was being told to them in the earlier stages. And that is how the trust gets built. You can't keep putting a moving target out in front of first responders, because they will sense it and they will respond to it accordingly. So thank you very much for that, Chief. Kevin,
yeah, one other thing before you leave. First responders, we like a lot of bells and whistles. We've talked about that too. Augmented reality, in-car computers, laptops, body-worn cameras, dash cameras, and biometrics, and all of those toys that public safety likes to have. Well, you need to have capacity on that for the network to work, and FirstNet makes it work. I mean, as a law enforcement officer, when you're out there in the middle of the night, when you push that button, it needs to work, and FirstNet's commitment has come through on that. They've got your back.
Yeah, fantastic points for anybody who's out there trying to engage those first responders as far as that in that first responder perspective when those conversations were being had. So thank you, Chief. Kevin, I'm going to turn to you, Chief McGinnis, and what I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is how did the EMS community become so important carrying the broadband message and the potential of what first responders could do with the broadband access? I think, are you muted, sir? Kevin, I think you're muted. Oh, we're not hearing you for some reason, Kevin. I tell you what, I'm gonna move on to the next question, and Kevin, we'll see if we can get your audio back. So sorry about that. Sue, I'm gonna move on to you. One of the things that has become apparent to many that are looking on to the United States and what we're doing here is that FirstNet is not mandated. You, as a first responder, you are not required to sign up for FirstNet. I'm curious your perspective on what impact you believe that has had on product and services that are being offered to the first responder community.
Yeah, thanks, Martha, and hello to everybody who's joining us today. That's a great question, and I think at first people were a little concerned about that, but I actually think at the end of the day, it's probably the best thing that could happen for first responders, because it spurs innovation and it spurs competition. So I know in many countries, in some of the folks that we've been talking to, they probably have a different model where there may be a requirement for first responders to be part of that network. I think the key to that is to make sure that first responders are a continuing part of the process, because frankly, if you don't deliver to first responders what they need and want, they're not going to use it. And so you're going to make a big investment in the network and in the organization to support it. And if you don't design what they want, it's just not going to work. So I actually think this model has worked very effectively, and it continues to be effective in the US today.
Well, and I think another important point, Sue, as far as mandate versus no mandate, is clearly when a switch gets flipped and we activate FirstNet and AT&T graciously puts their spectrum out there for us to have priority and preemption. Before we get a chance to meet those significant benchmarks, there's going to be disparity across the country. So I think allowing those first responders to make those judgment calls on when it is best, when they will optimize that network once it's built out in their area, I think that's a very empowering and important component of it as well. Because when you talk about some of these different countries or areas of the world that may mandate it, here's the deal. You better make sure that what you're mandating is up, ready to go, and will meet that mission critical standard, correct?
Not only mission critical, but I think you know, we talked about it. I think Jim mentioned it. You know, the innovation that's occurred, I think, is an indication of it. When you think about things like location services and HPUE, for example, in terms of the mega range product that was launched just a couple of months ago in the US, I think are examples of what happens as a result of that. So I think innovation is really important for first responders, but innovation is occurring as a result of first responder input. I think Jeff mentioned it. It's like, you know, tell us what you need. You don't have to tell us how, but tell us what, and then we'll figure out how to do it and deliver it to you at the level that you need it. So I actually think it's worked out quite well. And I think Jeff and Jim mentioned it, probably Jeff on his response, that, you know, the uptake in the US has been tremendous. And it's only because that AT&T and all the people involved have delivered to first responders what they need. And that's the only reason that that's occurring. So it's a real tribute, I think, to the entire ecosystem around this effort that's occurring.
Yeah, excellent points. Chief Johnson, I'm going to turn to you for just a moment because, you know, we've talked about the latitudes that have been afforded and how we've been very objectives driven, but there are elements of this FirstNet apparatus that were clearly a rigid elements and kind of unwavering benchmarks per se. So let's talk a little bit about that opting in process. Can you talk a little bit more in detail about what that actually is, what it means, and what were some of the most persuasive strategies and messages that you deployed in really getting that outreach and also the buy-in?
Well, good morning, my friends and colleagues on the call. It's when we built this, we went through this collectively and together, and it's good to see everyone's face. So some of the elected officials in Congress thought it was important that the states have a say. And that was known as state opt-in, where essentially the contractor, which we know as AT&T, was required essentially to cut a separate contract with each state, articulating their level of performance in that state. That's known as a state plan. So under Chairwoman Swenson, I was assigned the responsibility on the behalf of the authority to get these states to say yes to the network proposal. So that involved partnering with AT&T, our contractor, with a pretty large team to make sure we got our message out. We believed, Martha, we had the right message. We just had to tell the story. And we had to tell the story in an environment where there's other commercial providers that are already there that weren't very excited, frankly, about us showing up. So they were doing what they could to make sure that states made a different choice. And we were doing what we could to make sure the states understood this is by public safety, for public safety, and governed by public safety. And we just had to tell that story. And it got hairy at times. There were parts of it that weren't pleasant. There were a lot of it was just an enormous amount of work. But the fact is, we had a great story to tell. You just have to get the right people in the room, tell the story. And then you have to use the fundamentals that got us the legislation. You have to use public safety. You have to say, all right, who are the public safety leaders in that state? And then you have to reach out to them with the key facts, get them engaged, and then you just start working the process. But in the end, every state, territory, and commonwealth in the United States chose to opt in. And if FirstNet in and of itself wasn't unprecedented enough, having every state and territory opt in, that was beyond remarkable. A credit to everyone that made that happen.
Well, and I think what's really interesting is, you know, folks look at the United States clearly as a whole. However, we're very much based on that balance between federal and state leadership and oversight, right? So what a multi-front effort had to be executed to get all of those states to understand the importance. And I remember clearly the time when you had a lot of other entities trying to convince those governors that perhaps doing it on their own would be more fruitful. But what great work that you all did, and it truly is remarkable that that we achieved that cohesiveness that we were trying to achieve. You know, we had to move away from the patchwork quilt style of communications networks in this country and look for something and deploy something that was really going to capture everybody and make sure that people were transferring, you know, if they have to deploy across the country from state to state, you know, their communications were still going to be interoperable and seamless. So truly remarkable how much work went into that, Chief.
Well, you know, it was massive. I like to think of it in reverse. What if we started, you know, with the reverse? What if there was a nationwide ubiquitous network with a single technical standard, with accountability mechanisms in place for the contractor? What if we started there and then someone had the idea, hey, let's break this out into 56 different networks, and then let's make sure every city and county and village has their own network. And oh, by the way, you have to buy it and build it yourself. And yeah, use local money to do it. And then your stuff is going to be 10 times as expensive as the better device your kid has. I mean, who makes that argument? The fact is, public safety, we get stuck in what we know works. We will take a horse that shows up every day and works over a Ferrari that works every third time. We just will. And that's from a communication perspective, that's where we've been. And if you really think about it, it's insane to think about where we came from. And that's why public safety continues to argue that we stay away from state by state standards, state by state approaches. Here in the West, you know, we typically have 20 to 30 states in the West helping us fight these wildland fires. And if you don't have a single standard, I mean, what are we doing here? The problem is there are a lot of companies that have responsibilities to their shareholders to do what they do. And public safety has been mute for too long. We have not been informed and articulate and assertive about making sure public safety gets taken care of in the face of companies doing what they do very well. And this is some of the things that, number one, our lack of insight helped with. We didn't know this was impossible, so we tried. And in looking back, it was ridiculous that we achieved it because it was so impossible. The second thing that helped is not only with the contractor, but bringing on professional telecom executives like Sue Swenson and all her colleagues. They gave us insight we didn't have. We didn't even know we didn't know. So I think part of the mix is you have to have people that see things the way they see it. All we have to do is tell them what we need, build a contract around it, and we're done.
Sue, did you want to add something?
Yeah, Martha, I just wanted to add, I think I don't want to overlook the impact of the all states opting in had across the nation. And I think Chuck referred to it when he talked in his comments earlier in the webinar, is big cities and states don't have a problem doing this, but this was for across the nation. So, you know, locations that didn't have the resources or the capability now get the benefit of a nationwide network, you know, overseen and managed by AT&T that's common across the nation. So you didn't have the haves and have-not situation. So that opt-in at 100% was really critical for just the quality to first responders across the nation. And I want to make sure that people don't overlook that, because I think sometimes it gets overlooked.
And Martha, if I could just jump in real quick, the importance of having a network that works for everyone. And, you know, I talked about how we discussed that over 10 years ago in the NYPD in some of our first meetings on this, because this has to work for everybody. yeah, Sue's right. New York City could have built this, and we would have built it really well. I'll tell you right now, it would have been great. But it just couldn't be great for us. It had to be great for everybody. Now, are we at great? I think Jim Bugel will be the first guy to tell you we're not at great yet, but we're on the way there. And so the importance of this contract and the importance of the legislation is that FirstNet and the contractor that has the contract have an obligation of public safety. And we have to go from beginning to great. And, we'll get there, but we'll only get there with a commitment from everybody, public safety, from AT&T, from FirstNet. That's the only way you get to where we need to be.
And Chuck, I want to just add to that yes, there's work to be done, but today there are people who have got coverage who never had coverage before. There are people who clearly see the difference between priority and preemption. So we have clearly exceeded what public safety has ever had. And we are so far down this road, and really some of the most difficult hurdles have already been accomplished, to the thanks of people like Jim Bugel at AT&T, Jeff Bradshaw, Ed, and Sue, and everybody else.
Without a doubt, Dick, you are 100% right. And that goes to the issue of, how a big city would look at it, but you can't just look at it. You have to look at this globally. And globally, huge segments of this country are far better off now from a public safety communications capability than they were just 5 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I loved the dialogue there, gentlemen. That was fantastic. So, Kevin, I understand that you're back with us with your audio. So I'll go back to your question about talking about EMS's role in carrying the message of broadband potential for first responders.
Sure. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
That's just wonderful. I love technology when it does work. Sure. I think it's clearly in the process of going to the Hill for the legislation and going to governor's offices for the opt-in process later on. It was vital to have folks in uniform carrying that message in those across those tables. But they really had to have the right message too. And so, once we started to be able to get colleagues who were willing to speak, we had to make sure that when they got across the table, that they didn't suddenly have a blank deer in the headlights look, with a question that was asked about, well, exactly how are you going to use this network? And so it was really important to not only have the general messages like priority and preemption, which, by the way, is not an argument everywhere, because in rural areas, you're probably not going to have priority and preemption issues. You're going to have coverage issues, as we discussed once before. But to understand exactly what the discipline-specific applications are, or potential applications, and remember, when we were pushing this, a lot of our applications were just potential dreams of ours, because we didn't have them, because we didn't have the technology to support a lot of what was going on in hospitals on the EMS side. And then to be able to give very specific state examples or location-specific examples of how those applications would be applied. EMS, I've said this for 6 years when I was on the FirstNet board, and I believe it truly is that EMS is probably has the greatest potential for using FirstNet for a variety of applications. The dam sort of was holding back the potential of all our applications, and the dam being not having bandwidth to do things that we watch colleagues in hospitals doing, or people with landlines doing for telemedicine. And, frankly, EMS not only has those applications to present, some really attractive applications like using the golden hour as an example, the time from the point when somebody suffers a heart attack, a stroke, or is injured in a car crash, the very last moment that they can be surgically fixed in the hospital, and how FirstNet application in the field can save 20 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour or more in that application of the golden hour, save lives, are very attractive. And so EMS could bring those arguments to bear when, you know, a lot of times in public safety, people don't think beyond police and fire. And quite frankly, who doesn't love a paramedic?
That's right.
So,
Yeah, you're very convincing, right? you always love the
Well,
paramedics, especially when they're coming to show up to save your life, right?
certainly. And I
All
think
right,
the COVID situation has given us many, many more examples of how FirstNet has been employed for telehealth and other applications.
Well, and Kevin, to your point, you know, going back to what Chris said earlier in the panel discussion about the earthquake that took place in the midst of what might have been a low point for the FirstNet effort, COVID, despite how awful it has been, has really shed a irrefutable light on how important FirstNet is to all of the communities in the United States, because as these multiplying and compounding incidences, I mean, you had this overlying COVID response and these centers being stood up, but you know, life kept going, right? We had an earthquake in Salt Lake City, we had hurricanes. All of that compounding response requirements made it very clear why FirstNet was so important, because in blue sky situations, it's kind of hard to make the point where you really, really need this. And it will be different when the network is stressed. But when the network is stressed and it's demonstrative through that very situation, it's pretty irrefutable. So I really do appreciate that point. Jim, I'm going to move to you quickly. So many have said that the communications industry wouldn't commit to public safety centric hardware applications and, frankly, a network. Can you share your observations on the industry shift toward public safety interests with the advent of FirstNet, and how that knowledge might help others in trying to replicate the FirstNet effort?
So the interesting thing about that question is that I think it's been brought up by every panelist. It's the scale of the economics, it's the technology, but from a carrier's perspective, you look at the market, the addressable market. If the market's large, it's a large economic opportunity. If the marketplace is moderate to small, meaning instead of hundreds of millions of potential users to tens or 20s or even single digits, you know, commercial carriers tend to look for bigger opportunities. However, as we've discussed, a dedicated public safety network that is dedicated for public safety, you basically have not only the obligation, but you have the opportunity to really address the needs, as Kevin was talking about, other people, Jeff, were talking about, the needs that public safety has. And again, going back to the law, going back to the FirstNet Authority, the innovation is being driven by the ability to be able to put out a superior network and letting public safety say what they want on the network. The FirstNet Authority and AT&T, we're not prescribing what goes on the network. It's what public safety wants on the network. So basically what we've done is we've said, you have the opportunity to have your own Apple App Store, your own Google Play. The FirstNet Authority has provided an applications platform for you. Bring whatever you want. Of course, it needs to meet Jeff's API, KPI, security requirements, end to end. But basically, it's provided public safety a level playing field with the commercial carriers in terms of an applications platform. That's the big difference. And that was part of their mandate.
Well, and what I think is nice to those who are trying to stand up a like network in their country is we're telling them where the pushback was. We're sharing our strategy on how we overcame it. But what really is salient here is as the network developed, everything that we said, that first responders would rise to the occasion, and so would all of the app developers, hardware developers, and frankly the network would rise to the occasion as well. And so it really is nice to be able to define those pushbacks, the strategies, and then show that no, it's really a fruitful endeavor, and definitely worth taking a deep dive into it, and being patient and building all your coalitions and so forth. So yeah, so thank you.
Well, you know, like has been discussed, look, this has been a long journey, and you have, you know, Chris Moore and Chuck Dowd, Dick Murgon, Sue, Jeff, all these folks, right? Basically telling the commercial partners, the potential partners, if you want to provide this service for public safety, here's what you need to do. You're here, you need to go up here. Here's what you need to do. Some of the earliest discussions I had with Chief Dowd and Chief Moore were, look, you're going to have to really, really raise your game for us even to begin to have the conversation. And, you know, that was, again, part of the entire understanding of we had to build a network for public safety. And that's the baseline.
Yeah, and for all the naysayers that were out there, it's fun to watch everybody chasing FirstNet because it's highly unlikely, as we all well know, that anybody's ever going to catch it. And so because for every effort they put forward, we're usually 4, 5, 6, 7 steps ahead of them. So fantastic.
It's easy to comment on that.
Sure.
Nobody can catch us. It is impossible, and it's not because they're not technically capable of catching us. It's because there's no relationship between the shareholders and their requirement to serve public safety. And what you get in a company is when you're faced with a shareholder lawsuit for not making prudent commercial decisions, then you're in trouble with your shareholders. You just are. AT&T FirstNet is the only one that has a contractual requirement to serve public safety. And that contract creates the relationship between what you do for public safety and the shareholders. No other company can do that, period. So
yeah, and that is an excellent point, Chief. I thank you.
Yeah. And Martha, Chuck, just real quick, it's just not a contractual obligation on part of AT&T. It's an ethical obligation. It's a legal obligation created by the federal legislation. No one else is in that position. No one else has that long-term level of commitment. And quite frankly, Jim did a great job in building that into the AT&T culture over the last 10 years.
Yeah, and to our global audience, I will also point out that, you know, the whole point of this webinar is to avail all of this subject matter expertise within the private and the public, and frankly, with our incredible first responder leadership, to continually avail ourselves to make sure that as other countries try to mimic and replicate what we're doing, we want you to, right? We clearly want that to be the case. So, so yeah, I appreciate all of that perspective and how FirstNet is so incredibly different from anything else that is out there, and it'll never be duplicated in this country because of that framework. All right, Chris, I'm going to turn to you. We're getting to the end here. So what I want you to maybe say to our audience is, you know, what would be the first task that you would suggest folks undertake before beginning a nationwide public safety broadband effort in their respective countries?
Thanks, Martha. Can you hear me? Just to make sure.
You bet. You bet.
Absolutely. And welcome to all of our colleagues from around the world. This global public safety audience is really important because, again, public safety is public safety around the world. We all do the same thing. It's not for something. It's a labor of love. We are here to serve the public, straightforward, very simple. A couple things to start with. Number one, and it was already touched on by Ed Parkinson, actually touched on nothing. He said it straight out. And that is, unless and until public safety is ready to lead it in whatever country you're in, it's not going to happen. It just simply won't. It requires an understanding of what you need in your particular area. And it's different in the US than perhaps it is in other places. The governments are different, but the reality is that public safety needs it, and they say it to the public and the government will respond. I was always a believer in that. I think that played itself out. Second thing is something that Jim Bugel has mentioned a couple of times, and that is you cannot ignore the economics of this. I was one of those folks at the beginning that said, hey, we have to have our own greenfield network. It was, just what was ingrained upon us when we were in public safety communications for all these years. It had to be us. We had to control everything. And that's just not the case. And we came to that realization in talking to Jim. And Jim was a great mentor to a lot of people, saying, look, be real. We think we can get where we all need to be, but you have to be open. And that's the lesson, I think, for public safety around the world and for the wireless carriers in different countries, to understand that there is an opportunity for both to get something really special done like we've done here with FirstNet. But you can't ignore the economics. That's lesson two. A third note that I would say is something that Jeff Bratcher brought up, and that is we put some language in the legislation to include some money so that the Public Safety Communications Research Lab out in Boulder, where Jeff worked at the time, first of all, when we started this effort, we had really good technical people just advising us, and they weren't getting paid to do it necessarily. The government was paying them, but they didn't have money in their budget for us, but they just did it because it was the right thing to do. We knew that was going to be important and that we did not have the technical expertise. So I would suggest to you that you consider putting money in for that type of PSR support. And Derek was great, and Jeff was great, and Jeff moved over to FirstNet, which is really helpful. So a lot of that research and thought and experience came with him over to FirstNet. So consider that R&D proposal. Don't rely upon necessarily the carriers to have all the answers for you. It's good to have them doing that type of work as well. And then lastly, I would just say this, is that for all the people in public safety that want to do this, it is doable. Jeff is right. If we had to do it was going to be this hard or that was impossible, we probably never would have tried. But the reality was we were with one voice, speaking with one voice. We were together. We had disagreements, but we did it behind closed doors. Just stay focused. You're doing the right thing. People will support you. I really believe that. Your public will, your electeds will. Everybody in government is going to say, we're doing this not necessarily to make money. And then for the wireless carriers, again, look, they're in business to make money. We have to understand that. But we think, and we've shown, and I think I highly recommend you talk to Jim Bugel if you're in the wireless community elsewhere to say, look, what convinced you to allow all of your spectrum to be subject to preemption and priority for public safety? That was a brilliant move. And again, it created this sort of scenario where you have ricocheting. I like that description, Martha, where things are just ricocheting all over the place because you have innovation where, frankly, if you have a big long-term contract, there's really not much in the way of innovation. One last thing that AT&T did were these hackathons. They engaged people that were not necessarily involved in public safety, but they were in the tech community, these young upstarts, and they came in with some great ideas and are continuing to do so just with innovation. So again, I just close it out from my perspective. It's an honor to address everybody here. We do think we've hit on something here. We've been successful. It's been going for the last, literally, although it's been up and running since 2017. The reality is this effort's been worked on for since 9/11, and it requires dedicated people. Requires people like the Chuck Dowds of the world to say, "Stop! We can't keep hitting our head against the wall. Let's do something different." And sometimes it just requires people, like Jeff says, we didn't know, and you have to bring in as many smart people as you can. But never waver from the focus, never waver from the end game and the end state. I think you'll succeed where you set out to go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Chief Gillespie, I'm wondering if I can bring you back up for a moment. Are you with us still?
Sure.
All right.
I am here.
Okay, perfect. So from your perspective, being one of the early architects in this whole project, I know early on sometimes you can have these very grandiose visions that may not necessarily come to fruition. Can you talk a little bit from your perspective on where FirstNet has come compared to what you were envisioning during those formative years?
You've heard, or the audience has heard from all of these smart people after how this has happened, and once the legislation was approved, then we all looked at each other and said, now what? We know kind of what we think this is going to look like from our point of view, and you've heard the story of how that developed now, and it's such an amazing move from that day to where we're at now that I don't think, well, there's been so much innovation in public safety, and I use the fire service as my benchmark from these things, but It's going to be EFN or AFN, before FirstNet and after FirstNet. That's really where we're at in public safety. When we look back, when somebody looks back at shifts in public safety response and communications, they're going to look at this point in time and say, this is when it changed. This is when it began to change. Because the innovations, as you're hearing, we had an idea of what public safety communication would look like, and we saw some of the vision of that changing. But I didn't have any idea that it would change as rapidly as it has, and that it would be exponentially changing as rapidly as it has. All of the new innovations that we've talked about, the HPUE and the push to talks and the Z-axis and all those things that are happening already, and the communications with EMS out in the field to the end hospital where they're taking the patients. Those things we had some vision of, but we had no idea what was going to evolve. Something like the communications between the inoculation centers and the testing centers with COVID. Those things were proof of the pudding that what we were doing, what we were able to accomplish as collectively as a group, to make this happen in our time. It's just amazing. I used this analogy before lots of times that it's magic. It's the magic that comes out when somebody puts on the robe and the hat and waves the magic wand around, and it happens. And nobody else can do that. Nobody else. All they're doing is wearing a pointy hat and waving a stick. They just don't have what we have, and we'd love to share that with our global community.
Well, and yeah, thank you for that, because I think what I'm hearing you say, Al, is we hope that the successes that we're realizing here will be inspiring and will allow people to lean into the arduous nature of getting this done. You've clearly depicted how challenging it was and all the obstacles and everything else. But I really want to instill the hope in those who are trying to get it done, that once it's there, it's going to be so worth the lift. And please always keep that. Yeah, always keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think when you say that, we're here not because we're anything special. We managed to make it happen. So we're here to help anybody else that wants that, and if they just need the encouragement to understand that it is possible, that you can overcome the hurdles. We're there for that also.
Fantastic. Okay, we have come to the end. We've actually gone a little over, but I always love hearing from all of you, and I feel like the insights are going to be invaluable. Panelists, this is the conclusion of the Q&A, and heartfelt thanks to all of you for participating and taking time out of your schedules. And to the attendees, thank you for spending time with us today. We sincerely hope that you feel like it was time well spent. Again, we are the Public Safety Broadband Technology Association, and we want to continue to provide you with ongoing insights and access to all aspects of standing up and maintaining a nationwide public safety broadband network. If you'd like to visit our webpage, you can find us at thepsbta.org. There you will find more information on the association, our live FirstNet User Summit in Las Vegas, Nevada in January of 2022, and recordings of all of our previous webinars. We're also working on creating a PSBTA global page, which will contain information sharing opportunities, in addition to content specific to the mission of developing FirstNet-like networks across the globe. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded in its entirety and will also be available on our webpage. We have also provided individual sessions as separate recordings so you can easily access and review any of the specific materials of interest to you from today's content. If you have any questions going forward, please don't hesitate to email me at mellis@thepsbta.org. And we truly do look forward to future engagements with you and your agency. This concludes the PSBTA Global Webinar Insights on Implementing a Nationwide Public Safety Broadband Network. Thank you again for your time.